Welcome to the Dan Norton Show. It is Wednesday, June 11th, 2025. I promote Ayn Rand's philosophy of reason, egoism, and capitalism, and I invite you to discuss it, debate it, either through chats on YouTube or you can call in. I have pinned in the chat the instructions if you want to call in. Someone said he left a comment on my video after the last show, said he was going to call in. So we'll see if that person calls in. But the phone lines are open to anyone, and you can call in at any time. I invite my viewers to uh, engage in the chat through questions, comments, just saying hello. And I will use that material to generate discussion. And the earlier you participate in the chat, the more likely I will get to your comment. Okay, so until we start getting some engagement, I will give you a little updates on what I've been doing since the last stream. I stream on Wednesdays and Saturdays, so the last stream was on Saturday. Since then, I have been reading a lot about the book of Genesis in the Bible, specifically the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I got interested in this through my prior study of Israel, which I've discussed on stream various times. So I wanted to know the biblical lore, uh, which I have actually read the Bible, the entire thing, cover to cover. It was a long time ago, and it's there's a lot to digest. So even though this is not completely new material to me, there's just so much to learn about that I found it worthwhile to spend some time reading about the Old Testament. Uh, Specifically, I've been focused on the first book of the Old Testament, uh, the book of Genesis, and even more specifically, I was just reading about Jacob, one of the patriarchs of the Jews. So he was the son of Isaac, who was the son of Abraham. Those are the three patriarchs, as I understand it. Um, I wasn't raised religiously. I didn't go to synagogue or Bible school, so I learned about a lot of this after I was already an adult, and I just wanted to familiarize myself with cultural history. And what I've learned recently is that it seems like there are three major patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then I don't know if there's anyone after that who's called a patriarch, but at least up to this point, it seems like maybe those are the only three. Um, so I've been learning about Jacob recently. His son Joseph was sold into slavery in Egypt, and eventually, I guess the Jews, God's chosen people, were uh, I don't know if all of them, maybe all of them were sold into or were became slaves in Egypt. And then eventually there was an exodus from Egypt. Moses led them out of Egypt back to Canaan, or I'm not sure how you pronounce that, but basically modern day Israel. So that is some of what I've been learning about. Um, Other than that, I have been continuing work on my scripts for a series of videos commenting on my appearances on the David Pakman show. So this is actually the largest show I've ever been on. It has over 3 million subscribers on YouTube, and I called into that show 3 times. I think the first time was maybe almost 2 years ago now. Um, s- so I want to get those calls on my channel, but in order to do that, I needed to do a commentary video. I couldn't just upload the call straight without any changes because David Pakman did not allow that. Um, but he said if I did a commentary on it, then that would be fine. So that's what I'm doing now. And I've completed most of the script for a video or for the 3 videos. Um, I think I've got probably over 90% of us, at least the first draft. Some of it is more polished, so I've done actually a few drafts of the first 2 commentary videos on my first and second call. But the third call, um, I've mostly drafted a script, but I've got maybe about a minute or so left of the video to comment on. So it's getting close to the end of the drafting phase. And then after that, that's just getting the script together. Then I have to do all the visuals and edit things together. So I'm not sure how long all that's going to take. But that'll be coming out, uh, I guess, sometime this summer. And hopefully that will generate some traffic to my channel. I got a lot of traffic when I posted my calls to Sam Cedars' show, The Majority Report. That's actually been the show that I think my appearances on that show have been viewed more than any other appearances I've made on YouTube. And so a lot of people have found out about me through The Majority Report. And some of them have called in, as you might know, people like Darwin. And actually, the person who told me he was going to call in today, I think he also heard about me through the Majority Report. That's my guess. Um, and I'm hoping that some of David Pakman's listeners will also find out about me through these videos. I guess some already know about me from when I originally was on Pakman's show, but maybe there are more people out there who haven't seen those appearances, but maybe they will see my commentary videos, and maybe that'll attract some more viewers to my channel, and then maybe we'll get some more callers from that audience. We'll see. Okay, so those are the 2 main things I've been doing since the last stream, and I see we got our first chat of the day from Darwin, who I just mentioned. Thanks, Darwin. So he says Palestinians are indigenous to the Levant, colon. Okay, I guess he's about to write something else. That's just his introduction. Um, so if you're joining the stream, thanks for being here. I appreciate the likes and that helps. That'll help push the stream out in the YouTube algorithm. So I definitely appreciate that. So Darwin's next comments is if the link doesn't go through, it's Almari et al. 2021. Okay. I did not see a link. Let me refresh it with live chat. It was on top chat. Sometimes that filters things out. I don't see a link, so maybe YouTube filtered that out. I don't know how to change that. I know that sometimes when I've chatted on other people's channels, it will filter out certain things like links. Um, maybe because that's it's a way of getting someone to leave the channel. If you click on a link, that might take you somewhere else, and maybe YouTube doesn't want to encourage that. They want to encourage people to stay at a given place. Like if you're watching a live stream, they don't want to encourage content that takes people away from the live stream. I'm not sure, but I, I've seen other types of comments that get filtered out, and I think that might be the explanation. But anyways, I guess we can look this up. So this is some link relevant to the claim. that Palestinians are indigenous to the Levant, and then Darwin says it's always confused me that current day Palestinians also descend from, quote, Israelites. So it's ridiculous not to honor their rights to their ancestral homeland, but the genetics is beside the point. And Robert is also here. Hi, Robert. And he says in the middle of Darwin's comments, so what solution do you support for the conflict in the Middle East? And then he also says YouTube does not permit chat commenters to post links unless they are hosts or moderators. Okay. I also noticed I did a super chat on your on Brooks show a few days ago, and I had to edit it before it was accepted by YouTube. So YouTube will also it has some kind of algorithm for moderating super chats. So I was going to submit a super chat that said it's I got more subscribers since the last time I super chatted on his show, and I mentioned what my channel was, Dan Norton 1, and I said, thanks, value for value. That's a phrase Euron often use. Like if you're giving him something, he gives you something in return. You give him money through a super chat, and he's giving you the content, right? He's doing his show. And there was a kind of value for value exchange that I experienced I gave him money through a super chat, and then I got a bunch of subscribers after I did that. So I said value for value in my next chat. And thanks, as for being a platform where I could mention my show. But something about the way I worded that tripped the algorithm in YouTube, so I had to revise it a little. I'm not sure, maybe make it sound a little less markety. Maybe they thought it was like some spam marketer. So I had to change a few words, but it eventually got through. Um, it just took a few re-edits. Um, Robert says, yes, I heard your super chat mention, and yes, the filters 86 a lot of my comments. Okay. I guess that's a code word for like filters out or puts in the trash. 86. I think I might have heard that somewhere. And then he says, Iran has been quite good about sharing other objectivism related adjacent shows when folks like us super chat about them. That's good. Good to hear. I might want to try to take advantage of that some more. Um, okay, but let me come back to Darwin's comments about Israel, Palestine, see if I have anything to say about that. Now that I've been learning about them some more. So one thing I was reading about is that, at least according to some scholars, the book of Genesis was written around the 5th century BC, so the 400s BC. But the events described in Genesis, they go back to the beginning, right? Uh, so I think some scholars have calculated like 4000 BC as the time when the earth began or the universe was created by God. Um, but how much, if any of it, is historical is a question. And according to some scholars, it was largely just mythology, which was written down many centuries after the time that the book allegedly describes. Like the period of the patriarchs, I think, was during the first millennium BC, so between 1 and 2000 BC. The and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were sometime in there. But the stories about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob might have actually been written several centuries later, like in the 400s BC. So Do we know who actually inhabited these places? I'm not sure. Um, but I don't think it matters too much, or maybe, I guess not at all, to the present conflict in the Middle East, because I think what determines whether you have a right to live in a certain place is not events that happened, you know, hundreds or thousands of years ago, unless I guess you could establish some kind of unbroken chain, like someone rightfully acquired the property and then someone else rightfully purchased that property from the original owner, and then that person sold it to another person. And if you can find some kind of chain of custody and the original property was acquired in a just way, then I guess you could say the current occupants have a just claim because there's been an unbroken chain of just transfers of property from one generation to the next. But there's been so much turmoil and coming and going of various empires conquering each other. Um, so, and I don't think just wars of aggression are means of establishing a just claim to a land. So, a lot of what happened in history, I think, is just you have one group conquering another, and neither of, you know, in no case, uh, it might be that none of them have a just claim to the land. They're just brutes conquering each other. And it's not until you get to sometime in the modern era that there might be known historical facts about who justly acquired a certain piece of land. There are some records I know that, like when there were certain waves of settlement of Israel, they're called aliyahs, Aliyah. I think that's what they call the immigration of Jews to Palestine. And there were several waves of these aliyahs from Jews around Europe and maybe other parts of the world too. I think in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. And I think in during some of these phases, there are actually records of Jews or organizations working on behalf of the Jews who were purchasing land from the people who already lived there, the Arabs. And you might think those provide a starting point you could use for who has a just claim to land. So this is if you're just purchasing land from someone, you're making them an offer and they can accept it or reject it, then it's a voluntary transaction. And I think voluntary transactions are the way to go when it comes to establishing rights. Just conquering land is not the way. But if we have these records of voluntary transactions of some Arab choosing to do business with some Jew, selling land to them, then you might think, well, that's a good claim. That's a legitimate claim there. Um, okay, so let me come back to the chat. Oh, looks like somebody has entered the waiting room. Wade. I don't know who Wade is. That's a different name than the person who said he was going to call in. So, Wade, could you identify yourself in the YouTube chat? I like to have some idea of who who someone is who's trying to call in. So, if you could just type in the YouTube chat if you are Wade, I'd appreciate that. Maybe I'll give you a minute to do that. Um, okay. I don't know how long he's been there in the waiting room. Okay. So, there's some thoughts about the inhabitants of the Levant. That is the Eastern Mediterranean coastal area where Israel is. Um, that was all triggered by Darwin's comments. Oh, Wade O'Donoghue. Okay. Thanks for mentioning that in the chat. Okay, I remember seeing you on a previous stream. Okay, so he has said he wants to chat about capitalism. Uh, okay, we can do that, and maybe I'll have more to say about Darwin's comments later. But I'm going to give priority to the caller right now. Just a heads up, I might need to take a break at a certain point, as I had to do in the last stream. I've got a health issue, and it's kind of unpredictable in terms of when I might need to take a break to deal with it. Um, Hopefully not too long, but just a heads up in case that happens. But I think right now I'm ready to take Wade's call for a while. So let me go back to the waiting room and admit. All right. I just hit admit and he disappeared. Oh, it says two participants. I don't know why his screen is not showing up. Oh, it says he's joining. Maybe it takes a while for him to. Oh, now he appears. Okay. And I've got him on. He's muted, so I have to ask him to unmute. I just did that. Hello.
Hello,
Hi, Wade.
can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hi, Dan. Yes, in regards to capitalism, first off, I just want to say that I don't want to see capitalism disappear overnight. I understand that it's basically part of the story of humanity. As we change over time, we go through different ways of being, essentially. And but I do see problems with the system that I'd like to discuss with you.
Okay. First, before we get into it, I'm interested to know a little about you. Just for example, how did you come across my show, for one thing?
I just saw it on my feed, to be honest, and then I came in. Was it last week? Was it I think it was
Yeah, I think it was
end of
about a week
last
ago.
week, and
Okay.
you were stuck in a free will loop of conversation for two people, but it went on and on.
Yeah, we
And
had
so
two
yeah.
calls on free will the same day. So most of the show was about free will versus determinism. I guess that was a week ago.
Mm,
Um, okay. And
mm,
I remember some other people, including Darwin, I think, were still in the chat, but they were talking about political issues. Um,
mm, mm.
all right. So you want to talk about capitalism? Have you ever read Ayn Rand?
No, no, not particularly.
Okay.
Um,
As you probably know, that's the her philosophy is the framework I use to think about all
mm,
kinds of things, including political issues and capitalism. So, what exactly capitalism even means is a topic that we might get more into in this call. But
mm,
so, I think there's a common understanding of capitalism. Like America is often called capitalist today, but I wouldn't say that. I'd say it's a mixed economy. So,
mm,
I don't know the best way to get into this. We could talk
mm.
about like exactly what you think capitalism is to make sure we're on the same page about that, and we're not just talking past each other. But if you want to start it off in a different sort of way, that's fine.
Well, I'd like to start with the discontent that I have, and you can tell me if it's even applicable to capitalism. If
Okay.
that's okay with you.
Yeah, so you have
Okay.
discontent with capitalism today, you would say?
Yeah, and generally speaking, maybe even what it uh, what it causes in people, like how it causes us to think and view the world. So not necessarily just today, over time.
Okay. So already I think we probably should discuss what we mean by capitalism, because I would say capitalism doesn't
Okay.
even exist today. So if you have a problem with what you're calling capitalism and you're referring to something that exists today, I would say, well, we don't have capitalism. So
Well,
um,
I'd agree with you that it exists on a spectrum from what would you say, capitalism on one side, and what would be on the other side? Would it be socialism?
um, there are different things you could put on the other side of the spectrum, like maybe authoritarianism or statism,
Would be
dictatorship.
the polar opposite of capitalism, authoritarianism.
Yeah. Just one other thing before we go further.
Mm.
If you don't mind, I'm curious where you're calling from, like maybe another country or United States.
Yes, I'm phoning from South Africa.
Oh, South Africa. Okay.
Mm. Mm.
Interesting. You might be the first person from there that I've had on my show. So, anyways, welcome.
Mm. Thanks
Okay,
very
so
much.
yeah. Okay, so it's a spectrum you mentioned. I don't think of capitalism as existing on a spectrum. Well, I guess you could say it's at the end of one spectrum, as maybe you were just saying, and you were asking what's on the other end of the spectrum. So I guess the spectrum that could be used is freedom versus coercion, and that you can have an axis, and there's more and less freedom depending on which side you go to.
Mm.
And I think the fundamental issue in politics or political philosophy is the issue of freedom versus coercion. So
Mm.
I think that might be a good um, way to measure different
And you would
systems.
put
And I would
capitalism
say,
on the freedom side.
yeah, I would say that's where you have freedom. And then there are various degrees of coercion. So you have a mixed economy, which I think is what most Western countries are. There's some amount of
Okay,
freedom, but there's
but
also a
okay,
large amount of coercion. And then if you have total coercion, like a totalitarian society like Nazi Germany that controls every aspect of your life, or maybe
mm.
Soviet Russia under Stalin, um,
But
then that would
on
be on the
the
other end of the spectrum. So it just depends on how free a
yeah,
society is. And there are different kinds of freedom. There's like freedom of speech, there's economic sorts of freedoms, and
okay.
different countries might be more or less free in these different aspects. But maybe you could also assign like
So,
a general level of freedom. But anyways, I think freedom versus coercion is the fundamental issue along which various countries will rank differently.
but if I come to market with more purchasing power and you have less purchasing power, um, let's say it's your grandfathers were hardworking and they were business savvy and they made a lot of money, but my grandfathers were lazy, dumb, whatever, and I happen to be born poor, and we go to market, and you happen to have a lot more money than me. Is it my fault that I don't have the same opportunity to take fruit off the shelf? Is that freedom?
Yeah, it could be freedom. Because I don't think freedom is defined by how much economic power you have. You could distinguish between economic power and political power. And
Yeah,
this axis of measurement, this freedom versus coercion axis on the spectrum is an axis of political power. And that's
yeah. There's
different than the
different
power
forms of
of
power,
money.
right?
Yeah, different than the
Mm,
power of money. And I
yeah.
think it's important to
Women also have a
distinguish
different
those.
kind of power. There's different kinds of power.
Yeah, like
Does it
someone can
matter?
offer me all the money in the world. I've mentioned this example of bribery a few times before on my stream. Like you can offer me all the
Mm,
money in the world, You
mm.
can try to bribe me to promote socialism or
Mm.
communism, or
But you're not an
progressivism,
average
so-called,
YouTube influencer, no offense.
but it's not going to work. So you can't. Now you could point a gun to my head. That would be political power or the power of force or the power of coercion, and then you could threaten me and say I'm going to shoot you if you don't say these things, and
That's
that
what
might
I'm
get me
saying. Mm.
to promote some anti-capitalist system. But just offering me
A
money
lot of people
leaves
do
me free
sell
to
out
decide.
for the money, though, Dan. You are just one of the few good ones.
Yeah, I mean, people are open to bribery. That's true, but it's also true that uh, that requires consent on their part, and it's still respecting the
Yeah.
person's voluntary consent. You leave it up to them to decide whether or not to accept the bribe or not. So there's a
Yeah.
fundamentally different kind of relationship going on between someone who's
And if you only
making
live
you an offer
once,
and someone who's
why
threatening
not
you
live
with
well?
force. Excuse me?
If you're an atheist, you feel, or not necessarily an atheist, maybe that's unfair towards them. But if you have you're not morally grounded, you might just take the easy route in life, be corrupt, um, and take the paycheck, eat the steaks, live in the big house, and just lie about it. What do you mean?
Mm. Some people might do that, but there's a question as to whether that's actually in their self-interest. I think a lot of
Well,
people
I
are
think a
short
big house,
range.
lots of money seems to be in self-interest, especially on a shallow way of looking at it.
Yeah, on a shallow way of looking at it, and I think that's important. If you have a deeper way of looking at it, I think a lot of things that are called self-interested or selfish actually are
Mm,
not. So if you take
hmm.
bribes, you're open to corruption, then I
Yeah.
think if you consider all the consequences of that, not just some immediate effects, then you could actually judge the person is worse off. Like you have to live a life of lies, you have to hide it all the time, you can't live openly.
Mm,
So I think that's a negative effect of
hmm.
engaging in something like bribery. If anyone ever finds out, if I find out you've taken bribes, then I'm not going to want to deal with you, and I might advertise the fact and expose you,
It's not
and
always
maybe
cut
turn you
and
into the
dry,
police.
invest in my Bitcoin. Oh shit, the price fell. Sorry guys, it's not always cut and dry who lied and where's the devil in the story. From my side, coming from South Africa, we have a problem with self-catalyzation, if that's the right word. When you go jogging and your body starts breaking down your muscles to feed itself. I'm not exactly sure of the word, but basically, people are making money by breaking down the system in corruption. Um, does that have to do with capitalism? Is that just corruption? It's not
People
always
are
cut
breaking
and dry.
down. Well, I guess it depends on how they're breaking down the system. Like if you have anarchists or like rioters, like maybe there are some in the right now. There's some, or recently at least, there have been riots in Los Angeles uh,
Mm,
due to some the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, has been engaging in these raids on people in Los Angeles to identify uh, illegal immigrants, and they're rounding them up. And there have been protests recently and riots. But I think some of the rioters, I think
mm,
it's Euron Brook was actually talking about this on his
mm,
show recently. He's another objectivist podcaster I listen to a lot.
mm,
And I think he was saying that some of the riots has been hijacked or infiltrated by people who have unrelated motives, and they just see it as an excuse to destroy civilization, tear
mm.
down society. And so you have
No,
people
yeah.
like burning these
Mm.
Waymo self-driving cars. Um, so depending on the type of corruption, like
Well,
if it's
not exactly anarchism in that sense, just more like you work at the coal station, so you organize your buddies to come grab a load of coal and you get a few bucks out of it. Or maybe you get your family into government contracts to build a new bridge, but you do it very inefficiently, so a lot of money gets wasted. So it's not necessarily surface level anarchy in that sense. It's just frivolous wastage and incompetent running of funds, if that makes sense. So it's just
Yeah, so
selfish.
it wouldn't be, well, I wouldn't call it selfish, and we can get into that, like why I wouldn't call it selfish, or at least I would want to qualify it in some way and say it's really not self-interested if you consider the long-range consequences. So, but maybe setting that aside for a moment, I do think there are different ways of being anti-capitalist. So anarchy is kind of an overt, obvious way. You're just trying to tear down a system, like maybe some of these rioters in LA are. But then you have just your common criminal who's not really out to destroy civilization as such, but he tries to maybe rob someone at a, maybe he's a
Mm,
bank robber, or
mm,
he tries to steal from convenience stores. I
yeah.
would say these are anti-capitalists in
Would
that
you would you
the
steal from your own house, Dan?
well, hold on, I'll get to that. But if you're a
It's
thief.
on your point. It's on your point. I mean, sorry not to interrupt. Sorry about that.
Okay, well, I'll come to that example in a minute. But if you're stealing from stores, I think that is anti-capitalist behavior. Your
Mm,
goal is not like the anarchist goal of overthrowing the system. But it might be just some short-range benefit. But
mm,
the principle of capitalism
mm,
is respecting voluntary choices and not initiating force against another
yeah,
person or another
yeah,
person's property. And if you
yeah,
steal, if you're just a thief,
yeah,
you are initiating force. You're not taking something
yeah,
because you made an offer and they're voluntarily choosing
mm,
to give it to you. You're just using force, and that is
yeah,
anti-capitalist.
yeah.
But you asked about
Would you steal from your own house?
would I steal from my own house?
I know it
I'm not
sounds
sure
stupid, but
I'm not sure what you mean, because
what
if
my
something is
meaning
in
with
my
that is,
house,
yeah, yeah, it's obviously stupid. You don't even need to really, yeah. What I'm saying is these people that riot, they want to, they don't see themselves as part of the system. They see themselves as victims of the system. So they don't see the money flowing in a circle, kind of like blood in an economy, and it feeds everyone. You know, the food comes from the farms and it goes into the shops, and the leather and the, you know, the whole body of the in cycle. They just see themselves as one little individual cell that's being rejected by the body, and as such they feel it's okay to go into a shop and just steal. It's not their house. In the analogy that I'm using now, it's obviously the owners of the business's business. That's not what I'm saying, but they are still part of the economy. They're still a valuable unit within the system, but they don't feel like it. So if you felt that your country or your city or the place where you find yourself is good to you, you wouldn't want to steal from it. You wouldn't want to break it down. You wouldn't want to reject it or burn it down, or whatever. But if you feel it's against you, it's not working for you, that's when you can run in and steal something and it will make sense to you.
well, I think that it's possible that people are rationalizing their being victims. Like they could have done, they could have supported themselves, but they're pretending like they cannot do that, and they're blaming their own problems on the system, and they think that justifies them in just randomly uh, victimizing other people who haven't initiated force against them. So I think there's it could be that a lot of people are just telling themselves stories. They're pretending like they're victims when they're in fact not. They're taking
Mm,
on a victim kind of mentality to justify their actions. But does it really make sense? Does the story they're telling themselves really make sense, or is it just a rationalization? for for their own failures.
Well, if we're
And
social animals, we're not born with rationality. We learn rationality over time. Those of us who are blessed enough to be exposed to it, if you're not even exposed to rational thought, and that's a ladder to climb on its own. What I'm saying is, if you can solve the emotional situation, um, that could help them calm down and think rationally, and because people can be emotional as well. So saying they should be rational and that must just, they're wrong because they're not rational is not really solving the problem either. And I understand there's a problem there.
well, I do think appeasing people who are being irrational is a problem. And uh, I think it could be that sometimes police are appeasing criminals. They're too soft on criminals, and maybe not because the police themselves necessarily want to be soft, but maybe the people who are directing the police, maybe the politicians who set the laws. Like in California, there I don't know if this is still the case, but for a while there was a law that like you cannot be if you stole, I think it was like $950 or less of merchandise, then I don't know if you could even be prosecuted. Um, in some there was some kind of way in which the penalties were um, I think they were too soft on crime. And then I think this encouraged people
Oh,
to loot stores because
I don't.
the consequences were so minimal. And if you cater to that sort of person, you encourage more bad
Mm,
behavior. And I think part of the way to treat people that people should be treated to make them act more rationally is to actually have laws that punish people for doing certain things and not encourage things like looting or
mm.
rioting. That's I think that's one piece of the puzzle.
I think one punishment should be behind respect. So if you can't respect each other, then you must punish each other.
If you can't respect each other, then punish each other.
Mm.
Well, I guess what does punishment mean exactly? Does that you mean like physical, corporal punishment? Like I might not respect
Like
someone, but
if
that doesn't
mhm.
mean I'm gonna come to blows with the person and fight
Mm.
them. I might just choose not to deal with them. So depending on
Yeah.
the reason for the disrespect. Now, if I don't
So
respect
the, so
someone
the mhm.
because he's been rude to me, that's going to be different than if I don't respect someone because he's physically assaulted me. I think two
Mm.
very different sorts of responses are appropriate. So if there's physical force involved, then a response could involve physical force, either by me if I'm in an
Mm.
emergency and I have to defend myself, or I could, if it's not an
Mm.
emergency, if I can call the police to deal with the physical threat, then that's better if it's
Mm.
possible. But if it's there's no physical force involved, if someone's just rude to me, for instance, then I can deal with that by just not dealing with the person or blocking the person if it's someone on
Mm.
social media. So just depends on the context as
So
to
what I'm
how to
talking
deal.
about is the mutual respect between people, the average feeling of respect between people within a nation, which is not stagnant. It changes over time. So how people feel about each other. That's one option. So having a high level of respect is like a kind of magic. I respect you, you respect me. I won't harm you, you won't harm me. And I know it sounds like it's not founded in anything, but it's like you don't need cameras and policemen and all these kinds of things to enforce it. It just happens. On the other side, you can take the responsibility from the person to show respect and put police on the corners and put cameras up and surveil the person from an external position so as to force him to have respect. Now, is forced respect the same as chosen respect? On the surface, yes, but I would argue that it does touch on liberty. So you should rather go for the mutual respect. If you can't reach that, then fall back on cameras and policemen.
Okay. Well, I think the point of cameras and policemen or at least policemen, is to deal with cases where people are forcing each other. So you have robbers, rapists, murderers. These are people who initiate force against
Yes.
other people,
Mm.
and you want to get those people off the
Yeah.
streets.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely. Yeah.
I don't really think of that in terms of an issue of respect. I think of it more in terms of an issue of coercion or rights. I think rights fundamentally
But
is not
mhm.
using coercion. If you respect someone's rights, it means you're
So,
not using coercion or
but
initiating physical force against them.
but but then if you have a population and the level of respect falls, you'll have a bell curve that now falls below the threshold of people doing something bad towards each other. So if I respect you, I won't say something ugly towards you. But as my respect falls, there's a certain threshold that I'm going to start being ugly towards you. So the level of respect within a population determines how much crime is going to manifest. If people respect each other more, there'll be less of especially the lighter crimes. Maybe the murderers and things like that are just too way out of it, but maybe like bar fights or domestic violence or petty crimes in shops and things like that. If there's a higher level of mutual respect, I would argue that actually those crimes wouldn't even happen.
That I think that could be true. Like the more you respect someone, the less likely you are to have a reason to fight the person. Um, but I'm wondering how this relates to the larger discussion of like capitalism and
Well, we've taken a few branches here and there, but I think it's good. It's a good discussion. Could we get
yeah,
back
I'm
to capitalism?
okay. Let me just come back to the chat quickly and see what's going
Yeah.
on there. I haven't looked at it for a while. See, we got Robert, mini chats from Robert, and one from Darwin. Okay, so it looks like it's just Robert and Darwin. Uh, uh, I'll just read one from Robert right after Wade's comments. He says, "Capitalism is freedom, no more, no less. Some people don't believe freedom is appropriate for human relationships, and they should acknowledge that up front." Okay. And then there's one from Darwin replying to Robert. Uh, Not the one I just read, but I guess maybe some other comment from Robert. He says, "In what sense of liberals espouse free markets and individual freedoms? But so-called liberals often are in favor of taxes and regulations to some extent, at least, and those would be coercive um, things that the government does. So those are sense in which I would say the liberals are anti-liberty because they're endorsing coercion when they endorse taxes and regulations. Um, okay, but let me come back to you, Wade. So
Mm.
we were talking about
Yeah.
respect and crime, and
Mm.
I was wondering how that relates to capitalism. Because
Mm.
I don't really think of respect in relation to capitalism much. I think
Mm.
more in terms of rights or the issue of
Yeah.
freedom versus force. And I guess there might be some
Yeah.
correlation
Well, we're just
with
following the
respect. But
conversation. I think it just moved in that direction, maybe unintentionally in a way. All these things are loosely related. I don't know.
yeah, there's probably some like I guess there's a certain correlation between respect and capitalism. Like I guess maybe people are more likely to have respect for each other in general because
Mm.
people's rights are respected in a capitalist society. Whereas if you
Mm.
have like um, a in a mixed economy where you have lots of there pressure groups, like you have people lobbying the government for special favors, whether it's like tax breaks or subsidies or having regulations on certain businesses, but not your own business. You have all these people fighting with each other because the government is interfering in people's lives. And I guess if that's the case, some people might say, well, I want the government to interfere in a way that advantages me rather than somebody else, and you have people at each other's throats trying to exploit each other. Uh, so the more you have government involved, I think maybe the more of an incentive there is for people to um, not have respect for each other and not be respecting each other's rights. But I think a system that is based on a respect for individuals' rights, um, which means a system where people cannot force each other either directly themselves or by using the government as the middleman, outsourcing their dirty work, right? Get the government to put some regulation on some competing business, for example. Um,
mm,
and to the extent people's rights are not respected and they are using force against each other, then I think they're not going to respect each other. And also, I think
mm,
there's going to be less wealth in a society where you have the government intervening, and so people are going to be fighting over less and less wealth. Um, Maybe if you go to a totalitarian society, which is like on the one end of the spectrum of freedom versus force, there's just going to be so little wealth that people are fighting like animals over it.
mm,
So I do think there is some kind of correlation between respect people have for each other
mm,
and capitalism, but I guess it's more of
mm.
a indirect sort of feature of capitalism rather than
But
like a fundamental direct aspect of it.
Dan, I feel capitalism is an empty dream past a certain point. Like, if you have a comfortable house, you've got a comfortable car, you've got food, nothing to worry about. People should stop wanting to accumulate. But the capitalist idea of life is your value increases as your material material wealth increases. So most people don't stop, it seems. They just keep running, they just keep acquiring. And money is a spaceless entity. It takes up no space. So in a bank account, it's a bottomless hole. It's like a dark hole. It just absorbs matter. It just the more matter it absorbs, the more matter it can absorb. There's no limit to it. Um, so that's a bit dumb. It's a bit dumb in my view of the world, and it seems to make shallow people who just keep making more money, but they don't um, necessarily live nuanced lives. They don't necessarily pay attention to other things in life that is not money. And money is not anything. Money can be translated into anything, but in itself, it is nothing. So, in a weird sense, they live for nothing. Maybe that's harsh to say, but it feels like there's shallowness involved there. And I feel if we could get a better, highest value to live for beyond money, beside money, people will be willing to share their money back into the economy. And there's wealth inequality that keeps growing might subside in a certain sense. Everyone's fighting for that property, and everyone's fighting in the market for this banana or whatever. So if people weren't so greedy to increase their estates, there would be less demand in the market, which means there'd be less pressure. And also, we're social beings, and we are much more intricate beings than just wealth. There's so much more to a person. So if you live your whole life um, ticking ticking up the score of the money counter, you could play a lot of games, and every game has its own way to win, and the game of life's way to win is money. But these are we can set our own goalposts. So I'm not too sure if this is the best goalpost to set.
Okay. Well, one thing I'll mention first is I haven't said anything about money. And
Mm,
uh, I think that's telling because that's not really central to what I'm defending here. So I
mm,
think that what's crucial to capitalism is not an endless pursuit of money. It's
mm,
freedom. That's what the system is about. And I think people will be wealthier as a result. And I think wealth is better than poverty. Um,
mm.
but the essential feature of capitalism is not an endless pursuit of money. That's and it's not even a necessarily a non-essential pursuit feature
So
of
why
capitalism.
would that be called?
You could choose to make up to a certain amount and then retire and stop working. But the issue is it's a voluntary choice as to
Mm,
how much money you want to make.
mm.
And that's really what capitalism is about. It's about making voluntary choices about how you live your life
But they're
instead
all.
of being forced to live in a way that someone else tells you to live. Now, I think
Mm,
happiness is the most important thing to be pursuing in life. Ayn
mm,
Rand says that that's the highest purpose of morality. It's to achieve your own happiness. That doesn't necessarily mean you should pursue an endless amount of money. That might make you
mm,
miserable. Maybe you would be better
mm-hmm,
off relaxing
mm-hmm,
some and not
mm,
pursuing less money and just taking advantage of whatever money you've already earned to pursue whatever, some career, some hobby, take vacations.
mm.
So I think it would be a mistake to think that capitalism is a system that's in which people are endlessly pursuing money. Some people might do that, but that's not necessarily a good thing.
Mm.
The core feature of capitalism is freedom. People are free to decide how to live their own lives. They're not
But
being
wouldn't they be the
coerced.
richest among us?
Wouldn't what be the richest among us?
The people who dogmatically pursue money in and nothing else. They just spend their whole life pursuing money. Naturally, they'll end up with more money. And then who do we look up to? The people who are the highest on the ladder. So it seems,
You don't have to look up
um,
to them. Like I don't necessarily look up to someone just because they have more money. I might think they deserve criticism because they're wasting their lives pursuing their money when they could be having a happier life, pursuing less money and doing something else. I mean, it just depends. Maybe they're happy pursuing their money, but maybe they're not. But
mm,
just because someone is richer than I am doesn't mean they're better or that I look up to them.
yeah, I feel a lot of people don't have that same view. I feel like a lot of people see the wealthier person as the um I don't want to say better person, but maybe that's the word. But the more respectable person to look up to. I don't know if people have that nuanced look to life at life. It's just what car did you rock up in? How much money do you have? What suit do you have on?
Yeah, I mean, many people have mistaken values, I think. I think people have irrational values, anarchists, to mention something from earlier in the discussion. I think these are people who value tearing down civilization. Some people, I think, have an inappropriate valuing of money and riches, and they have too much of a focus on that instead of other things.
Mm,
But I think part of
mm,
ethics is teaching people, what is the most important thing to value? Am I perhaps valuing something in a way that's not best for myself, in a way that actually
mm,
undermines my happiness?
mm,
Um, and that's and I think this is part of what I'm trying to do on my channel. I'm trying to present
mm,
Ayn Rand's ethical viewpoint, which runs counter to a lot of conventional thinking about morality and goodness. Um,
mm.
so I think it's money is just one example of something that I think many people have incorrect view on its importance in life. I
Mm.
do think it's important, but I don't think it's the most important thing. I would say the most important thing is that you're living a life that enables you to achieve happiness. And just endlessly pursuing money isn't necessarily a means to
Yeah,
that. It could actually be an obstacle.
Surely life's more complicated than just the acquisition of money. That's like, it's actually a cop out to not look for more, because life is more nuanced than that. I think that I can't really speak for other people in that sense. That's my opinion about it.
Yeah, money is a means, or it's a tool. It's not an end in itself. I think it's a means to achieving happiness, right? You can buy all kinds of great things if you have money. You can live a
Mm,
much higher standard of living. But the goal is not the money
mm,
itself. It's to live a life that you
mm,
enjoy. That's how I
mm,
think of it.
mm. Um,
There's a
can,
speech
mm,
in Ayn Rand's one of Ayn Rand's novels, Atlas Shrugged. It's called the Meaning of Money speech, or by
mm,
one of the characters. So um,
mhm,
this actually might be available free online, or at least excerpts of it.
mm,
You might be interested in checking that out. Anyone who wants to get Ayn Rand's perspective on money.
mhm,
Like there's this idea, money is the root of all evil, or the love of
mm,
money is the root of all
mm,
evil,
mm, mm, mm,
which I think is a quote from somewhere in the Bible. And I think that the
mm,
Christianity has a very anti-materialistic or anti-this worldly sort of viewpoints, and I think that's
mm.
part of where that sentiment is coming from.
Oh,
Now,
yeah.
on Ayn Rand's view, she's very this worldly. She's very secular, so she's all
Mm,
about making your life the best that it can
mm,
be on this earth.
mm,
So she doesn't spurn money.
mm,
She doesn't reject it and say money is somehow evil. Um,
mm.
but that doesn't mean, on the other hand, that it's the final good, that it's ultimately what life should be about.
Yeah.
It is a good, but it's a good as a means to the greatest good in life, which is happiness.
Well, money is influence over other people. Do you agree?
Well, that goes back to the earlier point about bribery. Like you can try to influence me with money, you can make me an offer, but
Mm.
I'm free to accept or reject it. It's not like physical force where you can threaten me
Well,
with a
yeah.
gun and make me do things. So it's sort of an influence, but I think we need to be very careful in describing exactly what kind of
If
influence
if
it
if
is.
you are poor and you are going to die if you don't take my offer.
Okay, well, we can take that sort of case. This might be an emergency case, and I think sometimes things look a little different in emergency situations. Like it could be justified to kill someone in an emergency, like if you're on a lifeboat. These are called lifeboat cases. Sometimes there's two people on a lifeboat, and it's only big enough to hold one person. So you could be justified, morally justified, in trying to kill the other person who's fighting you for the lifeboat. But that doesn't carry over to non-emergency situations, and therefore, because it's okay in an emergency to kill
Mm,
someone, that now I can just go around society killing other
mm,
people. So you might
mm,
be in some kind of emergency situation, a
yeah.
lifeboat situation, where it's appropriate to take money from someone, which
Mm,
in normal non-emergency situations it would not be appropriate to.
mm,
And I think this often happens. People will try to argue
yeah.
from what's appropriate in an emergency as kind of a wedge to
Yeah.
say this is how we should act in general in society. In general, I think
Yeah.
people it can support themselves. You don't need to force other people. You don't need to accept bribes,
Yeah.
engage in some
Yeah.
kind of corruption. You could just work a
Mm,
job, support yourself, trade with other people. It's not necessary to
mm,
engage in force or fraud
yeah.
in a normal sort of situation.
So how much money changed hands last election between the parties?
You,
I know
you
Elon
broke up.
Musk
You said how much money changed hands in what?
in the elections, the by you guys in America. I know Elon Musk, um, what do you call it? Um, Essentially gave money to Donald Trump to help him with his campaign.
Yeah,
Do you
there's
know what I'm
political
saying?
donations.
Yeah. So surely that is
Yeah,
a form of influence.
yeah, it's a kind of influence. I'm not denying that money is an influence. I'm just saying it's not a kind of influence that force is, that physical force is. it doesn't take away someone's
So it's not
choice
a
or
it's not a gun with a bullet that has exploding powder that sends a piece of metal through your head, but it still has effect if you abstract it.
yeah, it has an effect, and it can have a motivating effect. Like there's the profit motive, right? I can be motivated to, um, I'm motivated by profit. Let's say if I'm a businessman, I know that if I'm Steve Jobs, if I invent this iPhone, or if I hire other people who invent this and then I market it, then I maybe I can become rich. I can become a billionaire. So money is definitely a motivating power.
But
That's
also
for sure.
influence. It
Yeah, sure.
influences people.
Yeah, but so where do you go with this though? If what's the implication of that? The fact that it has some kind of influence, therefore what?
So my argument is that you see, as a child, you see money as this magic thing that influences people. You go to the shop and you get a chocolate. You go to the movies and you get to watch the movies, or ice skate, or you want a car. You pay money and it influences people to give you the car. And on the other side, the flip side of that is a person's influence over himself. So you making the food, you building the car, you doing the other side of the transaction. And that's why you say, when you brought up Christianity, you said Christianity seems otherworldly, or in a way opposed to capitalism, maybe, or something like that. Is Jesus said, the 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 best servant among us is the closest to God, or something like that. So the person who's willing to make the food, the person who's willing to clean the house, the person who's willing to put in the work that results in the bliss or the fruit from the work, that results in the food you can consume, or the big house you can live in, or the fancy car you can drive. The other side, the what comes of it. So there's the effort you put in and what comes from the effort, and money buys what comes from the effort. But the effort you put in, we tend to call the workers. And um, in this worldview, we don't respect the people that put the effort in. We respect the people that get the effort, the owners, the people who have the money. Um, so when you go to the shop and you buy food, the person who's sitting at the till, ringing up your food, doesn't feel like she's got a hand in giving you that food. She's just there to get a paycheck. Same with the guy who raised the chickens on the farm that went to the shop for you to buy. Same with the guy who's driving the chickens in the truck on the way to the shop that you're about to buy. And same actually with the whole economy. The workers don't feel like they're actually a part of the economy. And I can't speak for everyone. This is my opinion on the fact on the matter, that they don't take pride in their jobs as much as what they're actually contributing to the economy. So obviously we're all 100% contributing to the economy, but the amount of um uh could I say respect, like people don't really feel like they're doing it. They don't feel like they're getting the like they're really part of it. They're working for a boss and they're getting a paycheck. So I'd argue there's a disconnect there. I don't know exactly what's causing that disconnect, if you can blame money or capitalism or whatever, but I feel like it must be sorted. When we were still in tribes, you knew exactly who went out to hunt and who did what and who contributed to the dinner that night, and everyone could say thank you for this, thank you for that. But now it's so abstracted, no one knows who to thank, and no one feels like they deserve a thank. So there's a form of alienation there, I feel like.
Okay, I think you might be using some Marxist terminology for instance, when you talk about alienation and workers being you talk a lot about workers
Mm,
in a way that it makes me think of like Marxism. So, I mean,
yeah.
there's someone working at a cash register in a grocery store. You mentioned something like
Mm.
that. They don't feel like they have a part in the system or something. I don't have that sense at all.
So you
I
don't
mean,
feel that.
I've worked various jobs, and I don't have any
Mm,
sense of alienation from a system. I understand these are all just transactions, and they're win-win transactions. So you're, let's say I'm a grocery clerk, and
mm,
I provide a certain service. I help someone check out his groceries, and I benefit from that, right? I get a
yeah, 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 yeah,
paycheck.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
So I do something for someone else, and then I get paid in return. I do something for
yeah,
my boss. It's all win-win transactions.
yeah. It's
Um,
very logical.
and
It's very how can you say it's logical. It logically makes sense. It's like a male argument. The female side would be, yeah, you brought me roses, but I want to see that you love me in your eyes. Yeah, you brought me food, but I want to know that you love me. So it's not the physical side. It's not the mechanical side of the situation. It's more the emotional side of the situation, I feel. Um,
that reminds me of a point I wanted to make, which is Ayn Rand has a great respect for production and producers. Actually, productivity is one of the virtues in her ethical system. So she identifies
mm,
rationality as being the primary virtue, but then it has various aspects. And
mm.
one of the aspects of being rational is to produce. And that's something
Yeah,
that
yeah,
we
yeah.
need to
I've
survive.
no argument about production. Um,
But
no argument with
it
production.
has a spiritual dimension to it. So,
Mm,
and Ayn Rand thinks it's a moral thing. It's not merely a practical thing. It's essential
mm,
to being a good person. I think
mm,
productivity is often not seen in that sort of from that moral angle. It's seen as, oh, maybe we have to be productive in order to be practical and take care of our physical needs. But
mm,
there's also a spiritual dimension to it. I think it's a
mm,
means by which you attain self-esteem. It's a way of
mm,
being able to support yourself and
mm.
justifying to yourself that I am a good person. I can take care of
Yeah.
myself. I can stand on my own 2 feet.
Mm,
It's a profound moral virtue on Ayn Rand's view to be
mm,
productive. It's essential to life. We don't produce
mm,
or we don't live just by consuming things. In order to have things to consume, we first have to produce them. So
mm,
if life is good and it is the ultimate good in Ayn Rand's view, then production
mm,
is a good. And morality on Rand's view is essentially about doing what's good. And since
mm.
achieving life is the ultimate good and productivity is a means to that, therefore, productivity is a moral virtue. So it's not just some brute,
Yeah,
materialistic, mindless thing. That's another aspect of it.
yeah,
Productivity is enhanced by the mind, not just doing brute
yeah,
physical labor, as many Marxists, I think,
yeah,
take production to be. They respect the
yeah.
workers on the assembly line who are doing manual or people doing manual labor,
Mm,
but they think the
mm,
CEO is just some worthless parasite who's uh,
mm.
shuffling papers in an office somewhere, and they
No,
don't understand the role of the mind in
yeah,
producing values. That's another way
yeah,
in
yeah, yeah,
which production is a spiritual
yeah.
kind of thing. It's a mental,
But yeah,
intellectual activity,
mm.
not just a brute activity of manual physical labor.
You know, well, the body can't live without the brain, and the brain can't live without the body. They need each other. But my argument would be that the workers see the boss as getting all the what would you say, all the accolades, all the respect, and there's none left for them. They don't feel they are as much a part of the creation of the production as they should, I feel. So I feel they feel disheartened, and they're just going to the work to get the job over with. They don't necessarily want to live themselves into their day. They just want to get the day over with. They just want to ring ring the food coming past in the shop scenario. They just want to get the day over with. Where
Well,
if we
yeah,
can,
some do. But I think what you should try to do is find a job that you enjoy more. And over time, you work your way up into more and more interesting positions. But
mm,
you might start in a job on an assembly line,
mm,
but that could be thrilling. And if it's,
I don't
let's
think
say
it's
this is your
inherent
first
to the
job,
job.
if this is your first job, it could be your first way of supporting yourself, and that could be exciting. But maybe over time, the excitement wears out, and you want to. It's good to be ambitious and pursue something even greater, something that you could.
Yeah.
Maybe you get bored after a while because it doesn't take long to master the job. But capitalism is a dynamic system. It's not a static
Mm,
system where you're just stuck in one position and you have to spend your entire
yeah.
life,
Yeah.
50, 60, 70 years doing the same thing over and over. No, you can make choices.
Mm,
You can move to a different job, move to a different location, develop a
mm.
new hobby, and there's so much opportunity for choices,
Mm,
and you should take
mm,
advantage of that. You shouldn't
mm.
stagnate in some position that you're not
Yeah.
enjoying, and you have much more opportunities in a capitalist system, I think,
Mm.
than in a government system. I think that limits
Well, yeah.
opportunities.
Well,
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it's innate to the job necessarily. Um, I think it's how you view yourself in the job. The job is stagnant. It's the same thing. But let's say that woman who works at the grocery store wakes up and decides, you know what, I am actually contributing to the production of this food. All these people that I see come past me every day, I'm actually helping to feed them. I'm not just here for a paycheck. I'm not just here because a boss says I must be here between 5 and 9. And if I'm not here, I can't pay my rent and my kids and all these worries. But I'm actually helping people. I'm actually doing something. Uh, some people might feel that way, but I'd argue that a lot of people don't. And why don't they? We need to address that. People need to recognize their contribution to the economy. If you wake up in the morning and you go outside, you see everything moving, but most people don't feel like they're contributing to that moving, even though they are part of that moving. They don't realize it. And that's not necessarily the job, but how they approach the job. And I don't
Okay.
know, maybe, yeah.
It seems like that might be a anti-individualist kind of way of looking at it. Like I think
Mm.
one's primary concern should not be how am I contributing to the economy. It should be how am I
No,
contributing to my own life. So if this woman who works at a
but no
grocery
one
store.
lives in a vacuum.
Oh yeah, sure, but
No one
the
exists in a
point of
vacuum.
life, the point of life, I think, is to achieve your own happiness, not to contribute
Yeah,
to
yeah,
the
yeah.
economy. Now, I think you
Yeah, yeah,
can
yeah.
contribute to the
No,
economy as a result.
you're
Hold on, hold on,
misunderstanding me.
hold on.
Yeah.
I'll come back to you. You can contribute to the economy or to other people's well-being as a result or as a side effect of pursuing your own well-being, but your primary concern in life and your focus should be on how am I
The
achieving my
fruit.
own happiness? For me, what am I getting out of this? Not did I contribute to the national GDP or something? Who
Yeah.
cares about that? Right?
You
It's
just
about
said
your own
Ayn
life.
Rand. You just said Ayn Rand said production is also an important part of the cycle. It's not just the
It's
product,
important
but
for your
also the
own life.
production.
For your own life and happiness, it's
So
important to produce.
that person is part of the production. They are producing these products. So it's not just the money they get at the end of the day and how they can spend the money on themselves. They're also part of the creation of the product. And if you honor that part, there's also value to be found on that side.
Not as an end in itself, though. Like if I help someone out,
Yeah,
then that's fine. But the
that
point of
should
it
make
should
you
not
feel
be to
good.
help the other person. The
Yes, it
point
should
of it
make you
is to
feel
help
good.
myself.
Helping someone else should make you feel good. It's just
Well, it
normal
depends.
human thing.
It depends. I mean, who am I helping
It's
out?
normal.
Should I
It's
help
like
out
a human thing.
Hamas? Should I help out a terrorist
Well,
organization?
you're taking it to extreme there. That's not what I'm arguing
Well,
about.
I'm challenging your principle there. And I think
Well, all
it's important
principles have
question.
limits, right? Yeah, my principles
Helping,
also have limits.
well, we have to define, how does this principle operate? I don't think it's the right principle to just say helping is good, period. Out
No,
of
no, no,
context.
period.
It depends,
Mm,
right? I think if you're somehow benefiting yourself by helping someone else, like if I'm this grocery clerk and I'm helping someone by helping them check their groceries out,
mm.
okay, but if I'm not getting a paycheck, if I'm not somehow benefiting myself by doing this, then what's the point? I don't think there is any reason to do it if you're not ultimately somehow benefiting yourself. And I think these
Yeah,
are
yeah,
these are win-win transactions, or they should be. But everyone should be trying to
yeah,
win himself, not at the
yeah.
expense. You're not
So
exploiting someone
everything's a
else. You're trading.
transaction, though.
You're trading.
Mm.
I mean, trade is a term you could use. What do you mean by transaction? If you're somehow trying to devalue it, or
So
there's
I
something
can't
bad
give
about it,
you, I can't
then I
give
wouldn't
you
agree with that.
anything. Yeah, I can't give you anything if you can't give me something back in return. Unless
Well,
then that's called charity. But charity has such a negative connotation. But think about where we came from in history through evolution and in humanity. Nature just drops its fruit from the tree. There's no transaction there. You just pick up the fruit and you eat it. So there used to be a case where if you have abundance, you can just share the abundance. It doesn't matter if that other person has something to offer you back. If your chickens bred and you got a surplus of chickens, you have chickens to give away. If you have millies and you have a surplus of millies, you have millies to give away. But in this system, it's all transactions. We cannot do anything for each other for free.
No,
What am
that's
I
not true.
getting out of it?
No, you're definitely free to engage in
No, we
charity
are
in a
free. Yeah,
voluntary
we
system.
call it charity, and it's negative. It's got this
No,
negative
I disagree.
connotation.
I disagree. So I would not agree that charity is negative. It can be. Now, again, it depends.
I'm not
Like
saying it's a bad
I
thing.
wouldn't have charity for Hamas, right? I'm not going to make a donation to Hamas, but I might have charity
Yeah,
to
but
someone who grows
charity
up poor.
implies a weak agent and a powerful agent. So if I can give you charity, you are weak. If you are the one accepting charity, you are weak. Why do you need charity? Why are you not standing on your own 2 feet? Charity's got a bad connotation to it. I'm not saying it's
I
bad
don't think it
to
does
help other
necessarily.
people.
Like, say
I think
someone
it's
is poor.
implicit.
I mean, if someone
Yeah,
is poor,
yeah,
then maybe
yeah,
they get charity, but I don't think
yeah,
that's a moral failing. It's not like there's
yeah.
some moral
And
problem with them.
so maybe you own some big company, you've got a lot of money, people working for you, so you can just go out and give food to the poor people. Yeah, no, what a great guy you are. You don't even work in the company. There's people who work in the company for you. You just earn the profit, but you're so blessed. You can feed the poor people. Thank God you were sent to earth, right?
Um, Blessed. Well, I don't know if I would use the term blessed if you have more money than someone else. I mean, maybe someone worked for that money and they earned it and they deserve credit for earning their money. And you were talking before about there's fruit dropping from trees. I don't think that's fundamentally how wealth is acquired. Wealth is produced. It's not just found in nature. Maybe someone had to plant that tree. Maybe someone is
Yeah,
a farmer and they have to do the work of running the farm, harvesting the
yeah,
crops. Could be a lot of work
yeah.
that goes into being wealthy.
My
Um,
argument there is just in the history of humanity, we haven't always had a transactional view on life. There has been millennia in human history where it was just a one-sided interaction, if you can put it in those terms. So you just got the fruit from the tree. You just got something from someone. You didn't have to give something back.
well,
Uh,
there's different kinds of transactions, if you want to call it that. Like there was material transactions and spiritual transactions. I
yeah,
think like material could be, I give you shoes and you give me money in return. You go into a shoe store, right? You buy the
like
shoes, some
barter,
material
yeah.
object, and then you get in return I guess the person selling the shoes gets the money, and you might say that's a
Yeah.
material kind of transaction.
Yeah.
But then you look at there's something like friendship, which you might call a more spiritual transaction, in that what's being
Yeah.
traded is not some
Yeah.
material good like shoes, but it's
Yeah.
like admiration. And that could
Yeah.
be a response to the virtue of another person. You think another person is a morally good person, and
Yeah.
so in exchange for them having this type of character, you have a certain emotional attitude towards them. You feel
Mm.
admiration or you feel respect.
Yeah.
And now,
Yeah.
is that a transaction? Well, how broadly do we want to define transaction? Maybe you could call that a transaction. But I mean, that
Yeah.
is totally part of capitalism and the system I support, right? I respect certain people more than others, partly
Mm.
maybe based on their material production. Maybe someone like Steve Jobs, I think, is a heroic producer. Other people,
Mm.
maybe they haven't produced much, but I think they're just very
Mm.
good people. They're very moral people. They're honest. They have integrity.
Mm.
And then because they have that sort of character, I have a certain amount of respect or admiration for them. And that's a
Mm.
kind of spiritual transaction. And we have to evaluate other people. Like if I want to evaluate a business partner, I'm going to judge their moral character. And that might
Mm.
decide whether I do or do not want to go into business with someone. So I think spirituality or the moral dimension of people is very much a part of the system that I support. It's not all just material transactions or trades. There's also a spiritual dimension.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree 100%. And I feel that that's kind of what's missing in today's life, that people are not necessarily living themselves into the job that they are doing, um, because they're working for the money. It's abstraction. You do your job to get the money. You don't do the job for the job necessarily. It would be an ideal world where you do the job for the job and the money just comes on its own. And some people might be blessed to have a life like that. Uh, I don't know. I don't know. Yeah.
All right. Well, I want to take a look at the chat now, see what's been going
Mm.
on there. Um, as for doing the job for the job. Like, I mean, there is such a thing as enjoying your job. So it might feel like you just enjoy the activity of working. It could be. I mean, I think ideally you can find a job like that. Like being a
Mm.
YouTuber for me would be the sort of a job where I enjoy the activity just for its own sake. I mean,
Mm.
not like isolated from the rest of my life, but it contributes in a way that I just enjoy the experience. I'm not looking
Mm.
forward to getting it over with or just looking forward to the
Mm.
weekends because I
Mm.
hate the activity itself. No, I actually enjoy
Yeah.
the activity. Now it's
Yeah.
I'm not really making money from it yet
Mm.
because my channel has needs to grow more. Um, so if you want to subscribe and help me get to a point where I can monetize my channel, I'd appreciate it. But eventually,
Mm.
if I get to a point where I can monetize this, then this would be a job which I enjoy doing.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are such jobs, but I think the ultimate point is to do what's going to benefit your life and enable you to enjoy your life. Um, but let me go back to the chat. I see Ben Franklin has come in. Has been chatting with Darwin, it looks like. Uh, so let's see. I can't read through all of these, but there was one from Darwin that caught my eye. He said, "My biggest beef with Dan." That was the only part I read, so that made me curious to see what his biggest beef was. He says, 2:18 p.m. Pacific. He says, "My biggest beef with Dan is that he believes that public good, like navigable waterways, should be privatized, even though that would be catastrophic to working class people." This whole idea of working class people is, I don't really like it because it sets up or suggests this kind of dichotomy between some people and other people, like the CEOs. And maybe there's an
Mm.
implication that like the CEOs don't work. There's just these parasites who don't contribute anything. And I think this is part of the Marxist view. There's a lack of respect for the mind and the intellects, which I think is the most important part of production, actually.
Well,
If you
Dan.
just do mindless physical labor, I don't think you can produce. You don't know how to produce or what to produce. The mind is a crucial component
Mm,
of production. But I think on Marxist theory, which you may or may not have read, but I think a lot of people have been influenced by Marxist theory, even if
mm,
they haven't read it, Marx himself.
mm,
I think on that sort of theory, there's this dichotomization between the
mm.
so-called workers and other people who allegedly
Yeah,
are not working. They're just parasites, and I think
yeah.
that's a very mistaken view of
So,
what's going on.
so then if you go for a jog, your body starts to burn. Your mind tells your body to run, but it's your body that gets damaged. So, they should be equivalent. The boss and the workers are even in the situation. We can't be without either one of the two.
Well, I think they're not equivalent. They both have a role. Like
Yeah,
the
workers are
mind,
more
there's
replaceable, sure.
they are more interchangeable. It's easier to replace someone on the assembly line because it takes far less
Yeah,
skill. Whereas
yeah.
finding a good
Is that
CEO
fair?
is very, very difficult, and that's why they get paid
Yeah.
so
So
much.
now you know why workers feel so threatened. They're replaceable.
Well, I don't think they should feel threatened because
If you're
there's so
replaceable,
much
that's
opportunity.
a threat. Oh, okay.
They were given an opportunity without the
Okay.
CEO. They would be in worse shape. They have a company they can just step into. They have a job role. They don't have to be self-sustaining farmers and produce
Yeah.
everything themselves. In
Well,
capitalism, there's
yeah.
a system where they can just walk into a job. A whole industry has already been created for them, and they can just walk
Yeah.
into the job and support themselves instead of having to
Yeah.
do it all themselves. There's what's
And
called
not really.
the
Yeah.
pyramid of ability that reminded me of there's a passage on the Ayn Rand lexicon. It's a work with a bunch of excerpts from Ayn Rand's writings, and I thought I would go to that and find there's an entry on what's called the pyramid of ability, which addresses this sort of point, and I want to read an excerpt from that. Um, so here's three paragraphs from the Ayn Rand lexicon. This is from a speech by one of her characters in one of her novels. So he says, "When you live in a rational society where men are free to trade, you receive
Mm,
an incalculable bonus. The material value of your work is determined not only by your effort, but by the effort of the
mm,
best productive minds who exist in the world around you. When you
mm,
work in a modern factory, you are paid not only for your labor, but for all the productive genius which has made that factory possible, for the
mm,
work of the industrialist who built it, for the work of the
mm.
investor who saved the money to risk on the untried and the new, for the work of the
Yeah.
engineer who
Mm,
designed the machines of which you are pulling the levers, pushing the levers,
yeah.
for the work of the inventor who created the product which you spend your time on making, for the work of the scientist who discovered the laws that went into the making of that product, for the
Mm,
work of the philosopher who taught men how to think and whom you spend your time denouncing. The machine, the frozen form of a living intelligence, is the power that expands the potential of your life by raising
mm,
the productivity of your time.
mm,
If you worked as a blacksmith in the mystics' Middle Ages, the whole of your earning capacity would consist of an iron bar produced by your hands in days and days of effort. How many
mhm,
tons of rail do you produce per day if you work for Hank Rearden? He's one of the characters in Atlas Shrugged.
mm,
He's a steel industrialist. And then continuing the quote. Would you dare to claim that the size of your paycheck was created solely by your physical labor and that those
mm,
rails were the product of your muscles? The standard of living of that blacksmith is all that your muscles are worth. The rest is a gift from Hank Rearden.
yeah,
And that's the end of that quote. So much for the idea that
yeah.
it's the CEO or the industrialist who is exploiting
Well,
these workers. Rather, they're
well,
benefiting tremendously from the
well,
industrialists and all these
mm,
men of the mines, you might call it,
mm.
who made his role on the in the factory possible.
But what, let's say I was born a generation after this intelligent person that figured out the steel industry, and I would also have figured out the steel industry, but because he figured it out first, he's now got a jump on the market, and now I don't have a space to enter the market, so I must just go work for him in his steel industry. Or would you say there's always space for another engineer or another boss or another intelligent person?
Well, there's always room for competition in a free market. And this guy, he faces competition, and he's not the only steel producer or metal producer in the market in the novel. There are other steel producers who try to get special favors from the government to compete against them instead of having to compete on the free market. So there's always
Mm,
free for people to compete, and that's a feature. There's no government monopoly. Like the post
mm,
office, where in the United States we've got a government monopoly on the postal service. So there's
mm,
certain kind of parcels of mail which only the government postal service can deliver. Rather, there's a free
mm,
market, and others are free to jump in and compete with whoever's already in the market. And
mm,
you could become a worker, and that's less risky. That's safer. You could be employed by someone else, or you could be
mm,
take more of a risk maybe and try to
mm,
be a competitor. But
mm.
it's up to you, and I think that's part of the beauty of a free market. You can decide whether to go into business for yourself or be employed by somebody else. It's
Yeah.
a system of choice and freedom and opportunity.
Well, I'd say that agency is being taken away from the workers because the boss says how the job is done, and you must fall within these rules. So wouldn't you say that workers generally um, don't think for themselves as much because they don't have agency in their day?
No, they can't think for themselves, and the boss will promote those who do the best at that. At least a good boss, right? You will value employees who are not just mindlessly doing some routine, but who think and say, "Hey, maybe we can increase our profits if we do an adjustment here, and maybe we can change some things about how we run the factory." And an employer or a manager might say, be a flame spotter and say, "Hey,
Oh,
that's a good guy to promote. Maybe we should move him up from the factory floor and make him a manager or something." So it's a
yeah,
dynamic system, and it encourages thoughtfulness, rationality, and it
yeah,
rewards that, right? If you get promoted, then
yeah,
you'll start making more money, and the people who are best at that get moved to the top because they have the best ability. They make the best
yeah.
sorts of choices and make the company the most money.
You never know where a good idea can come from.
Uh, yeah, sometimes it can be surprising. That's true. I just see that somebody else has called in, Kirk,
Mm,
who called in last show. So
mm,
I'm not sure what he wants to talk about. But anyways,
mm,
I think I'm going to end
mm,
this call. But thank you very much, Wade,
mm,
for calling in. I
mm.
appreciate it.
100%. Thanks, Dan. It was a great conversation.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Have a good day.
Have
All
a
right,
good
bye.
day.
Bye.
Bye.
All righty. So Kirk is in the waiting room now. He was he called in last show. We talked about perception and induction and some other things. So Kirk, could you let me know what you want to chat about? Um, Maybe this is a good time for me to take a little break, just for a few minutes, and then I can come back and see what's going on in the chat, and maybe take a call from Kirk. And I encourage you all to keep chatting, talk amongst yourselves. Um, and I will be back in a few minutes. Okay. Right. I am back. So we still have Kirk in the waiting room, and he shows up in the chat now as Panda Person. I asked him what he wanted to chat about. He says, two things I'd like to chat about: the objectivist theory of concepts, then problems with objectivist ethics in politics. And then we got Oh Noes is back. He says the government fails the ECP. I guess that's economic calculation problem. It would never succeed in a free market. That's why it has to have a monopoly or grant them. And then Panda Person, aka Kirk, says, I would also like to discuss problems with the objectivist understanding of causality and identity. But if you want to keep the call shorter, we can stick to the topics I listed above. Okay. So there's a mix there of various branches of philosophy. I was wondering if last time you were assuming that Kant was right or Wittgenstein. I guess we talked more about Kant in the last call, and then using that as a basis for disagreeing with objectivism or saying objectivism is wrong. So, uh, so yeah, if you do think Kant is right, then that would be inconsistent with objectivism, but I don't think Kant is right. So I guess we would have to debate Kant if we were to continue that sort of discussion from last time. Darwin says CEOs are fungible as well. Oh, please, CEOs are fungible as well, but not as fungible, right? It's harder to find a CEO, like harder to find a Steve Jobs than it is to find someone who, you know, tapes boxes for shipment, right? The skill set required is much harder to come by. So, um, that's why they get paid so much more. It's not to say that no one else on the planet could do the job, but there are not, millions or billions of people who could do the job. It's a much harder skill set to come by, so it's valued much higher on the market, and they get paid a lot more. Darwin says their egregious salary comes from stolen wages. Yeah, that's just a smear. That's a smear. It's not appreciating their role. And it's also accusing them of a crime, stealing, whereas this is a voluntary transaction. So that's an inappropriate way to describe what they're doing. Robber barons, likewise, that's a smear. I mean, there could be CEOs who engage in fraud, maybe like was it the Enron CEO who was convicted of fraud? But it's not inherent to being a CEO. Workers on the assembly line can also commit fraud and they can steal from the company. That's stealing. But working a job that you agreed to, that you have contractual terms for, is not a case of stolen wages. Yeah, that's inappropriate. I'm just looking at a few of these chats. It's a lot from Ben Franklin and Darwin. Okay. All right, so let me come back to um, Kirk or Panda Person in the chat. Let's also be polite. So it's fine to have disagreements here, but let's keep it civil. Whether you're a socialist or a capitalist, I mean, I want to welcome people with differing perspectives. A big part of the point of my show is to have discussions with people who do not share my perspective. But whether you agree with me or you disagree with me, let's just keep it civil. I think that's the way to have more enjoyable, productive discussions. At least the kind of discussions I enjoy. So, okay, so Panda Person, he says the objectivist theory of concepts and then objectivist ethics and politics. Um, and then he also mentions objectivist understanding of causality and identity. I'm more in a headspace right now to talk about objectivist ethics and politics. I guess at least partly because we were just talking about that, and I'm kind of more in the mood to talk about that. So I think I prefer to start with those and see how that goes. Okay, so I'm going to admit Kirk here and then see if we can talk about the objectivist ethics or politics. All right, I have just admitted Kirk. And next I have to ask Kirk to unmute. Hello, Kirk.
Hello?
Hi, I hear you.
Okay, good. So yeah, I called in to talk about I'm kind of person in chat to talk about the things about problems with objectivism. I was kind of busy doing something, but I was also listening in the background to the YouTube feed. You said something about preferring to start with the objectivist ethics and politics.
Yeah, yeah, I'd like to start with those if you're okay with that.
Yeah, yeah, we can start with those, and then do you think we have time in the call or in the stream to move on to some of the other issues that I listed?
Maybe it depends how long this goes. If I still have the energy for continuing, then we will. We can go on, but I don't know. We'll just have to see how this goes. I usually go for around 2 hours, which we're already getting close to. So I don't know if there's going to be time for it, but maybe we'll see.
So, so correct me if I'm mistaken, but my understanding is the objectivist deduct or Ayn Rand's not deduction, sorry, I should say induction. Ayn Rand's inductive approach to ethics is that she believes you can induce the principle that universally everyone should pursue what's in their rational self-interest from the fact that the only thing that has the ability to pursue values are living creatures, and the only thing that gives rise to the possibility of pursuing values are living creatures. And therefore, as I understand, Ayn Rand believes that induces the principle that the only universal moral standard is rational self-interest.
Okay, there's a lot going on here, so we gotta slow this down and break it down into little easy bite-size parts, and I'm gonna take some notes here. So you're asking about uh, you mentioned induction and inducing Ayn Rand's principle that's well, I don't know which if there was one principle you mentioned inducing, but I just remember you mentioned induction and let's try this. Could you just try to briefly restate like the essence of your question or comment?
So as I understand it, objective. Correct me if this is a mistaken understanding of objectivism, but as I understand, Ayn Rand believes she induced the principle that the valid standard of ethics is rational self-interest from the idea that in order to pursue values, one has to be alive, and therefore the requirements of life become the standard of ethical value.
Okay. Um, hold on, just writing this down. Um, Ayn Rand induced the principle that the valid standard of ethics is rational self-interests. And what came after that?
And the way she did this, as I understand, she says she induced it. I don't agree with her induction, but she alleged this is a valid induction, as I understand. So I'm not going to say she induced it because I don't believe she did, but she alleged she induced it from the principle that living beings are the only ones who have the possibility of pursuing values, and living beings, um, because living beings are the ones who pursue values, it's the requirements of their life that become the standard of value.
Okay. She induced it from the principle that living beings, or allegedly induced it from the principle that living beings are the only ones that have the possibility of pursuing values. And then there was one more part after that, or was that it?
But yeah, that sounds about it. That sounds like my understanding of what the objectivist ethics consists of.
Okay, so I guess there's two sentences here as I have it written down, and I guess the second one is the more fundamental. And so we could talk about both parts of this. So the second part, let me put that first in order since it's more fundamental because it doesn't specifically relate to human beings. It's about just value pursuit in general. So uh, there's one idea that only living beings have the possibility of pursuing values. That's one claim. And then later, downstream from that, there's another claim, which is that the valid standard of ethics for human beings is rational self-interest. Because they're the only rational creatures, so that wouldn't be applicable to other living entities. So maybe we should just break this down and take one of these. Do you have an issue with both of those,
Well,
or
but
just
well, I'll tell you that in a second. But just to clarify, that is the objectivist argument for rational self-interest being the standard of ethical value.
um, I don't know if I would say this is the argument. I mean, she wrote a whole essay, The Objectivist Ethics, and I don't know that it can all be condensed down into two brief sentences. Maybe, but I would need to think about it some more. So
Okay.
I think part of the argument is certainly that living beings face an alternative. They face a fundamental alternative of life or death, and that's what gives rise to their pursuit of values. If they didn't face this alternative, then they would not pursue values. If they were just like a rock, there's nothing at stake for a rock, or at least it doesn't have its existence at stake, at least not in the way that a living organism does. So I guess a rock could go out of existence like over millions of years if it's just worn down by erosion. But setting aside being acted upon by external forces like wind or rain that could erode the rock, it's just going to exist. Whereas a living being, if you like a mouse, if you take away things like wind or rain, it's not going to just exist forever like the rock might. It has to actively do things, has to go out and find food and eat that food and process it in its body. It has to do certain things in order to keep it in existence. And this is distinctive to living organisms as opposed to inanimate matter. So they have to do certain things in order to keep themselves in existence. So that's certainly one step in her arguments. And then when it comes to human beings, their primary mode of survival. Every organism has its own mode of survival, like the way that a mouse survives or a bird survives is going to be different, and the way a human being survives is going to be different again. So the primary means by which a human being survives is by exercising its rational faculty. Aristotle said man is the rational animal, or something like this. And I don't know that he appreciated the survival value. I don't think he did appreciate the survival value of reason, or at least not to the extent that Ayn Rand appreciated it. But on Rand's ethical viewpoint, reason is core to how we survive. And since I guess life is what gives rise to values at all, and for human beings, reason is the way of achieving life, at least fundamentally, it's our fundamental means of survival, then a life of rational self-interest, or rational keeping your own life going is the standard of value for human beings. So,
Let's see.
I,
So
I, yeah, go ahead.
so it basically sounds like I was right in saying that Rand was arguing that the standard of moral value is life because it it's life that gives rise to the possibility of values, because if you're a rock or an other inanimate object, you don't have the possibility of values. And so if you're living like a human being, the fact that your life is the thing that gives rise to the possibility of values as a living being, especially as a volitional being, because as I understand, she also believed that morality was tied to free will. That means that that becomes basically the standard of moral value is your life. So yeah, it sounds like that's basically right. And then she's saying that because human beings are rational in her view, that means that it's not just what's in not just their life, but specifically in their long-term rational self-interest. So it's not even just that what could sustain their life in the moment, or even just sustain their life physically, but more holistically, what brings their life flourishing.
Well, there's ultimately, I don't think there's a difference between a flourishing life and life for human beings. I mean, to live, like if you're not living this flourishing or what might be, I don't think she uses that term. I don't remember her using that term, but she uses phrases like life qua rational being or life qua man. And what she means by that, in part, is a life guided by reason. And to the extent you're not living a life guided by reason, to the extent you're living an irrational life, a life contrary to reason, you're moving in the direction of death. Now, it doesn't mean immediately you're going to die if you do one irrational thing, but you are moving in the direction of death.
But that doesn't
Um,
seem, but that actually doesn't seem like, I mean, it sounds like what you're saying does not actually seem what Rand's ethics seems to consist of, because as I understand, Rand believed that you don't, it's not just that you have a moral, it's not just moral to live, it's moral to live a selfish life, selfish being defined as pursuing what's in your best interest long term. So I'm saying if someone lived a life where they had food, water, shelter, and clothing, and so they would physically live for 70 years, basically a full human lifespan, but they lived like a crappy life, they were not happy, they were miserable, that would still be contrary to the objectivist ethics, even though they would still be physically living. So as I understand, like, no, it's not that Rand was saying that life is the center of moral value, but specifically life that is flourishing, or life that is pursuing one's rational self-interest.
well, what she means when she says life, I don't think is properly interpreted as just like bare physical survival. I mean, she explicitly distinguishes that view uh, of of existence or that mode of existence. Says man's life is the standard of more value of moral value. So I guess baked into the idea of man's life or life qua rational being as the standard of moral value is that you are living a long range principled um, sort of life. Maybe you could say flourishing life. That's what we should be aiming at.
Well,
And that's
so
what
yeah.
we need to achieve in order to keep ourselves going. Um,
Well, yeah, but what I'm saying is then that would mean that Rand does not just believe life is the center of more value. She believes life plus flourishing is the center of more value. Because by definition, life simply means continued state of your physical existence, and you can even argue like if your consciousness persists, you're living. But like if you're physically dying, then yes, Rand would be opposed to that, but she would also be opposed to you physically living and not pursuing your rational self-interest. So what I'm saying is, Rand does not just believe life is a sin of more value. She believes life plus flourishing would be a sin of more value. And you can say, well, that is what we're going to define life as. I don't care that what term you use, but the point is that she does not just say you have a moral, like it's not just good to it's not just more to live, it's more to live with flourishing. And that I mean that's probably a problem I see in Rand's at least argument on that front. But like if you think that's a misunderstanding of Rand, then correct me. But that's as I
I
understand
think
Rand.
it is. Yeah, 'cause I think that's separating life from flourishing in a way that I don't think she does. Like what I think she means by life is a certain mode of life. And to the extent you're not living that life, which is a life that supports yourself maximally or in a flourishing sort of way, you're actually moving towards death. So she has a novel called We the Living. And what that means there is not that we're like barely surviving. I mean, there are certain characters in the book who are living in the sense the robust flourishing sort of sense, or at least that's what they're aiming at. And not everyone lives like that. You could say they're dying, right? Or you might say they're engaged in a living death. And I think this can be kind of a tricky point. And I've thought about this sort of issue of exactly what is the relationship between life and flourishing or life and happiness. Um, and I think the way you're suggesting implies more of a distinction between than she is thinking in terms of more of a distinction between living and flourishing than she acknowledges. I think she sees them as more of a package deal,
Okay.
not in an invalid kind of way, because she does criticize certain things for being a package deal, but there's just a sense of living where it doesn't mean just cellular metabolism. And as long as, maybe you're a comatose patient on your deathbed, but your cells are still processing molecules, is that what living means for Rand? No, I don't think it is.
Well, okay, fair enough. But what I would say then is, if Rand defines life as the standard of moral value, and specifically life, not just including physical life, but also including flourishing, which I mean, I would say is not the definition of life that people use, but okay, whatever. It's a semantic thing, it doesn't really matter. But the point is, if Rand is ultimately saying that at the end of the day, you have a moral responsibility to live in the sense of flourishing, then I don't believe that's a logical deduction from her argument that living beings are the only ones who can pursue values. Therefore, because living beings are the only ones who can pursue values, you have a responsibility to pursue rational self-interest. I believe that's a non sequitur argument, because in my view, you could argue that you have a moral responsibility to keep living if your argument is hinged upon the fact that living beings are the only ones who can pursue values. Therefore, you have a responsibility to keep living. So, I, as a living being, have a responsibility to keep living because I can pursue values. Um, and that's my moral responsibility, my moral integrity. But then the only induction I could see of ethics at that point would be, I have a responsibility to keep living in the sense of physical existence. But if we're talking about flourishing, if we're talking about pursuing a genuine happy life, I don't see how you can induce that from the principle that living beings pursue values and give rise to the possibility of values, because just because living beings pursue values doesn't mean that as soon as a living being decides to continue to live, that the values they should, if we're talking on a normative perspective, pursue are values which promote human flourishing. I think that's kind of a non sequitur.
Okay, I'm not sure I followed all that, but one point I did want to make is you used this term responsibility, which Rand doesn't talk in terms of, as I recall, much. Like you don't have a responsibility to live, or I mean, I don't think she puts it like that. And she would also say you don't have a duty to live. So it's life, whether you live or not, is an issue of choice. But if you choose to live, then certain things follow. Like you need to exercise your reason and be honest and have integrity and be productive, all the virtues that are part of the objectivist ethics. So it's a causal perspective on life. If you want such and such end, then you have to enact such cause that will bring about that end or that effect, cause and effect. So I'm not sure that is exactly relevant to the point you were making, but I was just a little alarm went off when you used this phrase of responsibility to live or something like that. It made me think of a duty to live, which Ayn Rand rejects. She doesn't think there is a duty, like you have to do something as a categorical imperative, to use a phrase from Kant, like whether you want to or not, it's your duty to do this. No, it's just an issue of choice. If you choose to live, and then you have to do such and such, like be rational. But let me pause there because I'm not sure if that really engages with what you were saying, but you
Well,
can let me know.
yeah, I understand when I say the word responsibility. So as I understand, objectivism does reject. You could say what you mentioned Kant, like this idea that there's a moral imperative, like which is a categorical imperative, which just applies because it applies. Like it rejects the theory that morality is an intrinsic thing, but rather that morality is a set of values for a goal. So as I understand, the concept of duty does not necessarily appear in objectivism, but as I understand, objectivism does believe in moral responsibility, where you can judge an action as morally right or wrong, based on whether someone is fulfilling their responsibility to be rational. Now they don't. Now they can choose to not be rational, but as I understand, it would still be considered ultimately a violation of moral responsibility and moral integrity according to objectivism. So correct me if that's wrong.
Well, I mean, I guess you have a responsibility to be rational if you choose to live. So rationality is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. It's a human means of survival using our reason. And if we choose to survive or to live or to flourish or to be happy, I think these are maybe just different perspectives on the end that Ayn Rand thinks is worth valuing. If we choose to pursue that end, then we have a responsibility to be rational
Okay. Well, I would just say then,
to
but
ourselves. It's not to anybody else. So even if we're alone on a desert island, if we want to achieve this end of happiness or flourishing, we have a responsibility to ourselves to exercise our means of achieving that, which is reason.
okay, well, fair enough. But as I understand, that still would mean that there's a problem with how objectivism induces its ethical code, because if objectivism claims, as I understand it, that does that the standard of moral value. So you're saying if you choose to live, there are moral responsibilities, and that so correct me if I'm wrong, but using me saying that if you choose to live, you have a moral responsibility to be rational in order to continue living.
Hmm.
Okay, so I think the problem with that is if you're saying that if you choose to live, you have the responsibility to be rational by virtue of choosing to live, I would say that's wrong because it's possible to live without living in the sense of pursuing like rational or life-threatening values. Like I can physically sustain my existence without being rational. I can physically sustain my existence and do things which are actively harmful to my emotional or even physical well-being, but I'll still be living. And so the problem I have is um, living. If you say living beings, as soon as you choose to live, you have a moral responsibility to act according to that which will further your life because you've chosen to live. I would just say the essential problem there is how do you get around the problem that you can choose to live and yet choose to do things which are harmful to your physical or emotional existence, and yet you'll still remain in existence. That's the essential problem. Because if I say, because I could theoretically live, like I said, but if I behave irrationally, I could still live the same lifespan that someone who is living completely rationally would. Even if now you could say, why would I do something that's like not in my self interest? You can say it's stupid, but I don't think you could say it's immoral because if the standard is life and because you've chosen to live, then I don't think you can derive from life necessarily a full flourishing life. That I mean, that's the essential argument here. But if you're saying that no, like in order to pursue life, you actually have to pursue like life in a broad, like you said, qua man. Then like I would like to hear an argument for that, but I just haven't seen a convincing argument for that.
Well, I think this is going back to the earlier discussion about what is meant by life. So if life includes this idea of flourishing, then you do need to pursue, do need to be rational. And I don't think life just means lifespan. Like if you take two people, one of whom is in a coma for 70 years, and the other of whom is has a more normal sort of life. He's working a job. He has friends. He's married. He enjoys his wife and kids. He's got hobbies. Whereas the other person, he's just lying on a bed in a coma. I mean, Ayn Rand is not saying that, well, these are equivalent in terms of their worth, like they're both equally lives worth living. What she means by life is the one who is not in a coma, the one who is flourishing, we might call it. And to live that sort of life, and I guess to the extent you are living that sort of life, you're avoiding the coma kind of life. And I guess to the extent you are living an irrational life, you're going towards the coma kind of life. Maybe you're not there yet, but you're breaking down, you're having problems, and maybe you get fired from your job, you're ruining your relationships because you're acting irrationally. So things are going worse and worse for you. Even if you end up living the same amount of time, 70 years, let's say, um, things are going in the direction of death and suffering. Whereas that's not the case. And the person who's living rationally, he's living a life of happiness, not suffering. Um, Even if he ends up dying at age 70, his actions are not promoting his death in the way that the irrational persons are. So
Okay, well then let me ask you this: so how does Rand induce the idea that a flourishing life? I mean, you don't have to like the phrase flourishing, but just a life qua man, whatever term you want to use. But the life that you're describing, which is guided by rationality, how does Rand induce that's the standard of moral value? Because I thought the way she induced the standard of moral value was that living beings are the ones who can pursue values. Therefore, if you choose to live, you have to pursue values in order to remain in existence. Fair enough. Then I'm questioning is what part of that induction, what part of that equation does life qua man or does rationality come in? Like what other factor does Rand use to argue for a full flourishing rational life, if that's how she defines life?
I don't know if this is going to address what you're saying, but I'll try it anyways and see where it goes. So I think where we get the idea of value or goodness to begin with is from our experience of pleasure. I don't know if you were there for the show when I discussed this most recently. I don't know if it was one or two shows ago. Um, but I think we initially get the idea of something being good from our experience of pleasure as opposed to pain. This is just a mechanism that we come into the world born with, a pleasure pain mechanism as babies, and we have no choice about it. So just for example, drinking milk will give us pleasure. It's not something we chose to be the case. It just is the case that we experience it that way. And over time, as we grow up, we learn to be more long range in how we go about achieving pleasure. We don't just have to rely on someone else, like our mother, to bring her breast or the milk bottle over to us to satisfy our needs. We can supply our own pleasure. We learn to plant foods if we're, in an agricultural society. We've learned that we can plant foods now, and then many months later, we can harvest the crops, and then we can satisfy our hunger that way and obtain pleasure from eating that food. And we learn things like going to the dentist might cause us pain in the immediate moment, but in the long run, we can experience more pleasure because if we don't get the tooth drilled or whatever and taken care of, then we're going to have more tooth pain. So we learn to weigh pleasures and pains against each other and figure out ways of achieving the most pleasure over time. And there are different levels or kinds of pleasure. There's physical pleasure, there's psychological pleasure. So there's just physical pleasure is just like the pleasure of eating food, right? It just makes contact with your physical organs and gives you the sensation of pleasure. But there are also pleasures. For example, you just get a good piece of news. You ask someone, "Will you marry me?" Right? This is the woman of your dreams, let's say, and she says yes, and you experience a rush of emotional pleasure. Right? It's not like physical pleasure. Maybe she didn't even touch you, but you still have this sensation of or this experience of pleasure that you could call that a psychological pleasure. And happiness, I would say, is a kind of psychological pleasure. And over time, you learn more and more about how to achieve pleasure or in its broadest sense, including something like happiness, psychological pleasure. Um, According to the objectivist virtues, you need, or the objectivist ethics, you need to exercise certain virtues like honesty and integrity and productiveness to achieve your happiness or your psychological pleasure. Um, so you're asking about like how do we induce this idea of a flourishing life as the standard? I guess I'm trying to like relate it to experiences people have starting from the most basic primitive kind of experiences as a baby. You have pleasure as a baby, and then over idea of what pleasure or goodness consists of, and you learn more and more about what achieves that kind of pleasure or happiness. I think it's plausible that to achieve happiness or pleasure in its broadest sense, you need to exercise these kinds of virtues like honesty and productiveness. And then that all provides a basis for this idea of a standard, the morally best sort of life you could live. So it's from your own experiences living life and observing values and what works and doesn't work for achieving them. And it's all tied up with happiness and what frustrates your happiness or furthers your happiness. From all these experiences, you induce this idea of what a moral life looks like,
Okay.
where it's this life of rationality, rationality naming the fundamental virtue.
Okay.
But I've been going on for a while, so let me just pause there.
Okay. So now, like, I to respond, does that respond?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so, I would say to that, there's there's the problem, of, so you're saying that the standard of moral value is, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way you're phrasing it seems like it comes from experience. And I would say then, well, just because people associate goodness with pleasure does not mean pleasure is objectively good. I think you'd need an inductive argument to that. Now, the second thing I would add is beyond so because you can say, well, people categorize the experience of pleasure as good, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's objectively good. It just could be that it's subjectively the case. So that's thing one. But then the second problem is, so as I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, objectivism believes that your self interest has to be like, or your self-interest has to be selfish. It has to be what she calls rational self-interest. And so this is not necessarily like Nietzsche, who would say, well, just do whatever, disregard other people. Like, she's not necessarily saying that you should disregard other people, but she does believe that you should pursue what's in your self-interest, and that's your primary goal. And then taking care of other people is a derivative goal, only after you've taken care of yourself, and only if you believe taking care of them would be in your rational self-interest, right?
Yeah, I would agree with the second part. I mean, the point about pleasure being good and whether you need an argument for that, I have a different view of that. I don't think I would agree on that point. But on the second point of helping others, I would agree that on Rand's view that you should only do that if you think that that somehow contributes to your own self-interest. It's not an end in itself to help others.
Okay, so I would say then the problem is, so correct me if I'm wrong, but does the objectivism, uh, as I understand, objectivism on a political doctrine believes that if we're talking about the relationship between politics and ethics, or politics and morality, which is basically we have these ethical or moral code of rational self-interest, and from this ethical or a moral code of rational self-interest, this ethical or moral code gives rise to the political system that Rand advocates for, of capitalism, but not just like what most people call capitalism, of just like, having a generally free market, but like specifically, she believes the only legitimate function of government is the protection of individual rights.
Yeah. So are you transitioning to political discussion now? Is that
Yes, but
where
it's but this part's going to be highly related to the ethics.
Okay, well, before we do that, let me just make a comment about the prior point you made about pleasure and whether we need an argument for that. So, I don't think we need an argument to establish that pleasure is good. I think its goodness is just experienced. We experience pleasure as good. It's not like a separate step to first experience pleasure and then decide, should I regard this as good or as bad? I'm not sure that's right, that there is a further step. I think its goodness just kind of comes baked into it, and there's no there's no way to get the concept of good at all. It would be a meaningless concept if you didn't have that experience. And likewise with bad, if you didn't have something like pain, there would be no basis for saying anything is bad. So I think this experience of pleasure and pain is at the root of our concept or idea of good and bad, and you don't really need an argument. It's just kind of self-evident. You might call it an axiom of ethics.
Well,
Um,
I would disagree with that, but I think I would like to move on to the political stuff because I
okay.
think that's a conversation. Not that it's not an interesting conversation, but I mean it would require a lot more time, and like it seems like this show's kind of coming to a close soon anyway. So I maybe we should just get to the political thing, and then if we want to revisit the ethics, we can do it in a future stream.
Okay. Well, I guess we can spend at least a little bit of time on the politics. But I want to first go back to the chat. I like to check back in on the chat every once in a while, see what's going on. So let me let me go back there. I see Aaron Alfesh has come in. Hi, Aaron. Just seeing what new people have joined. Um, got some more chats here from Wade, Ben Franklin. Oh no's. Looks like okay, here's another one from Aaron. He says, feels good, feels good. That's all there is to it. That is at the base of what is good. Yeah, like where do you get the idea of good from? If not from the experience of pleasure. There is at least one sentence in Ayn Rand's article, The Objectivist Ethics, which is free online, by the way. So, have you read The Objectivist Ethics, Kirk?
I have not, but my understanding of objectivist ethics come from lectures I've heard from objectivists.
Okay. Well, I would really recommend reading this article. I mean, it's if you're going to read one thing on the objectivist ethics, I think this might be the best thing. It's an essay on if you just Google the objectivist ethics, I think you'll find it on the Ayn Rand Institute's website. Um, I would definitely recommend reading that if you want to understand her ideas about like her standard of value, where it comes from. And I remember there's one sentence in there about how pleasure and pain are the way we first experience the ideas of good and bad or value and disvalue, something like that. Um,
Okay.
okay, but let me just look through a few more of these chats. Ben Franklin says Dan needs to stop saying pleasure like that. Like what? Uh, and I don't know what you mean there. Um, um, and please do not be vulgar. I'm not sure what some of these comments mean, but I've
Vulgar, what?
I'm looking at something in the chat. I'm not talking to you, Kirk.
I could tell that. I just didn't know if they were talking about me or.
Yeah, I don't know what some of these I'm just kind of skipping around, so I'm not sure what they're referring to sometimes. Um, Aaron says you are right. That is metaphysical. You cannot go under reality. Feeling good feels good is the starting point. It doesn't need an argument. It just is. Okay. Okay. I'll read through these later after the stream. I'll have more time. I'll read the rest of these chats. Um, but I
Okay.
guess once somebody calls in, I give priority to the caller. Okay, so
Okay. But
we
now,
can spend a little time. I don't know how much, but we can spend at least a few minutes on the politics.
well,
So,
specifically, I would like to talk. So, The reason I wanted to talk about the politics was because I wanted to talk about what I believe is an inconsistency between the objectivist ethics and the objectivist politics. Where I believe if you take the objectivist ethics consistently, it would contradict the objectivist politics. But you said we have a few minutes to talk. Only a few minutes to talk about this.
Yeah, and by the way, here's another question for you. So, have you read Ayn Rand's essay? Well, actually, there's two essays I'll mention. One is Man's Rights, and the other is The Nature of Government.
No, like when it comes, most of the stuff that I've read from like online sources has been about her epistemology and metaphysics. The stuff I know about her ethics and politics mostly comes from lectures I've seen from objectivists.
Okay, I would really recommend you read these. Maybe if you want to call in again, you can. I mean, I'm not gonna say we can't talk more unless you've read these, but I mean, you're raising these criticisms, but it sounds like you haven't read the core works by Ayn Rand on these topics. So I think you really should do that if you want to come in here and criticize them and say like Ayn Rand got this or that wrong. You should first read her works and not just lectures or by other people. I mean, it's a fine thing to do, but I think primarily you should be focused on what Ayn Rand said if you're going to be criticizing her views, and then supplement that with lectures by other people.
Okay,
Um,
yeah. I mean, okay. Maybe if I make criticisms which you believe are not an accurate representation of her views on politics, then we can I'll look more into it. But just kind of just make the argument then.
yeah, yeah. For now, just go ahead with what you got. We'll spend, let's say, just a few minutes on the politics, and then we can continue at another time.
Okay, so the problem I have with the objectivist politics, at least why I believe it's internally inconsistent with her ethics, is because of the fact that if Ayn Rand believes that the legitimate use of government is the protection of individual rights, which so if correct me if it's wrong, but as an understanding who believes the legitimate role of government is the protection of individual rights, and individual rights, according to objectivism, at least the way I've heard it presented, is the recognition in a social context of the requirements of one's one's individual rights are recognition by the government of the factual requirements of the individual's requirement to pursue their self-interest. And so because the individual has a requirement to pursue their rational self-interest in order to live, according to objectivism, this means that rights are the political recognition of that fact. That's my understanding of the objectivist ethics. And the problem I have with this in relation to her politics is that if she's saying that the way to ground individual rights is um, based in this idea of rational self-interest, well, what I would say is there are times where if it's in someone's rational self-interest to violate another's individual rights, then that would be a contradiction between the objectivist ethics and the objectivist politics. Because if it's in my rational self-interest to violate the rights of another person, then according to objectivism, I should pursue my rational self-interest, and my rational self-interest in this case would be violating their rights, but then that would contradict the objectivist politics because objectivist politics stresses that individual rights are an absolute, and so I believe this is an internal inconsistency because if me pursuing my rational self-interest would involve violating the rights of another person in order to get pursuing my rational self-interest, then that would mean that I should violate their rights. If I'm going by the standard of objectivist ethics being rational self-interest, but then I would be violating the objectivist political principle of individual rights. For example, to bring this more concrete, if it's in my rational self-interest to steal from a bank, then I could presumably steal from the bank and I'd be operating according to the objectivist virtue of rational self-interest, but then I would be violating the objectivist political doctrine of individual rights, in this case property rights, because I would be violating the bank's property rights. And so this is an example where if my right to property is contradicted by another person's rational self-interest, then I think that would be an inherent inconsistency between objectivist ethics and objectivist politics.
Okay, so I did mention earlier in this stream, maybe it was with the other caller, that there are certain emergency cases, like if you're on a lifeboat case. Were you here for that? Did you hear that?
No, I was not. I have heard of the concept of emergency being sort of generally seen as like not an essential question within objectivist ethics, but I have not heard the specifics of how objectivism deals with. But my argument is not even from emergencies. My argument is basically that even in non-emergency situations, if it's in your rational self-interest to violate someone else's rights, then rationally self-interest, I would steal from a bank and steal from someone else and kill someone if I don't like them and will get emotional pleasure from it because I'm a sociopath, hypothetically. And all these things would be
Yeah.
violations of individual rights in a political context because you have a right to life and you have a right to property. But it would, even though it would be violations of individual rights, mean me pursuing my rational self interest. And so that would be an example where I think the objectivist political doctrine of individual rights contradicts the objectivist ethics of rational self interest.
Okay. Yeah. So these principles of not violating rights are contextual. So they're absolutes within a context. Um, so they don't. It's not like a duty to not initiate force against someone else, which is why in like in an emergency case, like if you're on a lifeboat and it could only hold one person, there's two people fighting for it, you could be morally justified in the objectivist view to try to kill the other person so that you can get on the lifeboat. But that is an emergency case. It's not how normal society works. But within the context of what you might call normal society, in that context, it's absolutely true that you should not initiate force. Now, even in that context, you're saying, even if it's not an emergency context, you think it's appropriate or it's rationally self-interested to violate people's rights. I don't agree to that, or at least I would want to hear more. Like, if you are a sociopath, this might be another um, exception sort of case, not exactly an emergency, but if you're a sociopath, then I think that also could just fall outside the context in which this principle is meant to apply. It's often come up in my
Which
debates
principle?
with people. Just a
Which
minute.
principle?
I'll come back. The principle of respecting people's rights and not initiating force. The principle of that is rational beings in a society dealing with each other. But if you're like genetically have some kind of defect that makes you a sociopath or something that such that you can only achieve happiness and pleasure in life by killing other people, then is it right for that person to become a murderer and kill other people? Yeah, I guess it is. But objectivism is not concerned with morality for sociopaths. This is a topic that some people often try to bring up in the sort of way I think you're bringing it up here as a kind of criticism or objection to the objectivist theory of rights. But we have to properly define the context of where does this principle apply. So if we're talking about normal human beings, people who don't have some kind of genetic defect that makes them a sociopath, if we're not talking about emergencies, then in that context, I think you could say it's absolutely true that you should respect people's rights, meaning you don't initiate force against them. So you just have to define the context of the principle correctly. And once you've done that, I think you could say within that context, this principle applies as an absolute.
Okay. So what I would say then is, even there, you still have the problem of the fact that there are times, even amongst rational people in normal context, where it could be in someone's self-interest. If someone's pursuing what objectivism considers to be moral or valuable, which is their rational self-interest, then I could still see many, or at least I could conceive of many examples where it's in someone's rational self-interest to violate someone else's rights. For example, if someone is poor and they would be more flourishing, they would have a bigger house, they would have better food, they would have healthier food. If they stole from a rich person, then that poor person would be in the rational self-interest to steal from the rich person, but it'd be a violation of the rich person's property rights. And so that poor person might gain more value in the sense that they'll have a longer lifespan, and B, they'll be live in a more flourishing manner because they'll have stolen from the rich person, um, which would be in the rational self-interest. But that would contradict the objectivist concept of individual rights. But this is not an emergency case, and it's not even necessarily a sociopathic case because even if they're not a sociopath, they could still, if we're doing like a calculus of what's in one's rational self-interest, gain more rational self-interest, or pursue one's rational self-interest more and get more both physical and spiritual value from stealing from the rich person, even though that would violate their individual rights because it's in their rational self-interest. And so I do believe even in non-emergency situations, there are cases where violations of individual rights could occur under the objectivist ethics.
Okay, I just disagree with that. I don't think the person is going to be better off stealing from rich people. I think that will hurt that person's self-esteem. I mean, I mean, it puts him in conflict with other people. Most obviously, he can get caught and thrown in jail, but even if he gets away with it, so to speak, I think it undermines his self-respect to be engaging in this sort of way with other people instead of being self-supporting and earning his own living in an honest way. I think that's the way to building uh, character, building self-respect, self-esteem, which I think is crucial to happiness. And I think he's undermining that, to get some material gain. I think that's a very short-sighted, irrational, self-destructive way of acting. But we gotta end it here because I need to take a break and maybe go back to the chat. And if you want to call back in and continue another time, maybe after you've looked into some more of Rand's essays, we can definitely continue some more.
Okay. Yeah. Good talking to you, and I'll see you. You say you stream Saturdays and Wednesdays?
Yeah.
Okay. I might see you next Saturday, or we'll see.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks for calling.
Okay.
Bye bye. All righty. So let me come back to the chat. So we've got oh, David Heffron says, good discussion. I will do the reading before calling in, Dan. Yeah, he's the one I had in mind. So when I mentioned at the beginning of the show, someone said he was gonna call in. Um, but yeah, I guess maybe a different show after he does some reading. So I'll mention three essays again. So these are the ones I mentioned to Kirk uh, in the call, but a core essay on the objectivist ethics is called The Objectivist Ethics by Ayn Rand. That's free online, and I definitely recommend checking that out. And then the two essays for politics by Ayn Rand, one is called Man's Rights, and I just Googled that and to verify if that is available online. Yes, it is free online. So this is one of the foundational pieces in the objectivist literature about Ayn Rand's political philosophy. The other one is called The Nature of Government. I think I'm going to put links to these in the chat after I verify. Looks like that one is also online. Just found the link. Yes. And then let me also get the link for the objectivist ethics. Okay, good. Got them all. Okay, and let me put them in. First, I'm going to include the link to the objectivist ethics. Okay, there it is in the chat. And then here is Man's Rights. And then finally, The nature of government. Okay. So those are some core essays in the objectivist literature, which I recommend to everyone. Uh, you could read them all today. I mean, these are very dense essays. Certainly, the objectivist ethics. I'm not recommending you necessarily read them in all day, in all in one day, because you could spend hours and hours. You could spend years studying these essays. There's very dense, concentrated source of ideas and insights. But I'm just trying to give you a sense of the length. These are not like huge novels, Atlas Shrugged or The Fountainhead. I definitely recommend people check these out. David Heffron says, actually, I am nearly home. I could call in. Mm, I think it might be better to do it another day because I think I might need a break and it could be better to just refresh when like not at the end of my show. Thanks for being here, everyone, by the way, and I appreciate the likes and shares and subscribes. Just checking my YouTube analytics here, seeing how many people have come by. I wonder how long you all would stay here if I just kept streaming and streaming. Would you all be here like for hours and hours? Or maybe you go and come back? David says, no worries. Look forward to chatting on Saturday. Yeah, I think that'll be better. Wade says, great discussion, Dan. Great discussion. Thanks, Dan. You're welcome. Great chat, Dan. Thanks for the effort. Appreciate it. This is a little lower intensity now than a call, right? Because I don't have to immediately respond to someone. So I maybe just going through chat here is good. More low intensity activity for the end of stream. David says, plus I can do the reading. Yeah, that'll definitely be helpful, I think. Highly recommend those articles. They all were published in a book called The Virtue of Selfishness, which is mostly on Ayn Rand's ethical theory, but she does have those two political philosophy essays, Man's Rights and the Nature of Government, which were also published in her next nonfiction book, which was called Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. They were published as an appendix. Man's Rights and the Nature of Government were published as an appendix to her book, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. Originally, they appeared in her periodical magazine or newsletter. It's called the Objectivist Newsletter, which she published from 1961 to 65. I think that's where Man's Rights and the Nature of Government were originally published, and then later they were some of her essays from that periodical were collected into books, The Virtue of Selfishness and Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. But the Objectivist Ethics was actually originally given as a talk, I think, at University of Wisconsin, Madison, I believe, in 1961. So that was a few years after the publication of Atlas Shrugged. Atlas Shrugged was published in 1957, That was her last um, fiction book that she published. And then after that, she turned to nonfiction writing and speaking. So she gave talks at universities sometimes. And I believe that's where the Objectivist ethics was first delivered. And then later that was published in her periodical, the Objectivist newsletter. And then eventually it was the lead essay in her book, The Virtue of Selfishness. Ben Franklin says, I like her book, but I'm not wrong. I don't know what book you're referring to there. She never wrote a book called that. David says, also quick question. I know that Atlas Shrugged is quite the tome. Yeah, it's over 1,000 pages. Is there a good resource to get the digested summary of Galt's Gulch? Maybe you mean Galt's speech. Digested summary. Um, there's a course given on it by Onkar Ghate. He's a philosopher at the Ayn Rand Institute. And I don't know if the course is available on the Ayn Rand Institute's website. Um, there's also a Cliff Notes on Atlas Shrugged. I don't know if I'm not very familiar with that. Maybe there's a good summary there. I'm not sure. Um, the speech is reprinted in her book For the New Intellectual, as well as other speeches from her fiction, which I actually so you might not want to read the nonfiction first because it could spoil the fiction. I did read the nonfiction first, and it did spoil the fiction to some extent. So if you can read the fiction first, I would recommend that. But I do know they are very long works, and I was very motivated to just get to the philosophical meats in the argument. So for me, I think it might have been best to start with the nonfiction, and maybe some of you all feel like that way. You're more interested in the uh, explicit philosophical arguments than the story from which the characters induce these philosophical principles. So this idea of induction came up earlier in my call with Kirk. Where do we get this idea of um, man's life as a rational being the standard of value? Oh, I think we induce it from experience as we acquire all our knowledge. So Ayn Rand is not a rationalist in the sense that of some of the early modern philosophers or Plato, who thought we had innate ideas. We just come into the world already with these ideas somewhere in us, and they just have to be teased out of us. Rather, she's an empiricist in the sense that we get our knowledge from experience. We induce it from our observations of the world. And I try to give some indication of how we do that. But you also see a kind of induction in her novels, at least through the experiences of the characters. They come to learn certain things about the world, and they induce certain principles of ethics, and not exactly like real life, but in an essentialized kind of way. You see some of the key steps or some of the key experiences by which people arrive at certain general principles of ethics or politics. Um, Wade says, David says, thanks. You're welcome. Wade says, how were you introduced by Ayn Rand? By my brother. He recommended that I read her book, Philosophy, Who Needs It? That's a nonfiction collection. And that was the first book by Ayn Rand I read, and I was blown away by that. I thought it was amazing. And I think it's a great introduction to philosophy as a whole, not just her philosophy, which she doesn't really discuss explicitly in that work or in the title essay, which the book is named after, Philosophy, Who Needs It? But I think that's a great place to start if you want to start with the nonfiction. If you can start with the fiction, I think maybe better because then there's no risk of plot spoilers. You can just have the greatest possible dramatic experience of reading the fiction. David says, I think Ben might have been making a joke about Bill Maher's I'm Not Wrong show. Oh, okay. I'm not familiar with that show. I did see Bill Maher speak once in person in New York City many years ago, but I don't really keep up with him closely. Um, all right, so do I want to go back through this chat some more? Ben Franklin. Have you read her fiction, Ben Franklin? Or are you just going on reports by others? I think it's really important to read Ayn Rand her own words because I think a lot of people misrepresent her. Looks like Ben Franklin might be a Marxist, given what he's saying here. I wonder how you heard about my show, Ben Franklin. All right. Okay. Well, I think this is a pretty good place to end the show. Been going for almost 3 hours. I think that's a record. So I plan to stream again on Saturday, 1 p.m. Pacific, my usual time. So hopefully I'll see some of you again there. Thanks for any likes, subscribes, shares. Definitely appreciate all that. Ben Franklin says YouTube recommended it to me. Okay. All right. Well, we're done for today. So thanks again for coming by. Have a good rest of your week, and I'll see you in another stream. Bye, everyone.